No, Mary, I'm waiting for Mary. Oh, Mary, oh, here you are, sorry. So unusual, Mary, to find you quiet, you know. Welcome to the 8th annual Daniel O'Connell Summer School. I suppose we should simply call it school. But before we're proceeding with the formalities, I'd just like to call on Mary to say a few special words about her late friend, Junior Murphy.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It's wonderful to see everyone here and to be able to join together once again. And to all joining us online, we're so delighted to be coming live from Cahirsiveen this morning. It's been a difficult few years for so many people, and we are thinking very much today of all who have lost loved ones since we last gathered. For all of us here this morning, there is one person in particular who we are all thinking of and who is missed so much by everyone. And that is our dear friend, Junior Morris Murphy. I had the great privilege of being one of his students many, many years ago. He was a wonderful teacher, an incredibly kind man who managed to get the best out of everyone. He was a people's person who always had a smile on his face and an optimism and love for life that was so infectious. You always felt better after being in Junior's company. Even after he retired, Junior continued to help so many of his students achieve their dreams. From 2009, Junior and his beloved wife Phil visited us every year in Derrynane. This meant a great, great deal to David and I. We so loved those visits. And when in 2013, the year of the gathering, we were asked by the then county manager, Tom Kern, and the gathering team to consider recommencing the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. It was very important to me that the event would be held in the town where Daniel O'Connell was born, Cahirsiveen, and also to have it in Derrynane, so that it would become a 2-day event. There was only one person to call on, and that was Junior. When he visited with Phil again, we sat together and chatted, the three of us, and from then, it's history. Afterwards, of course, he contacted his dear friend Mirish, and so the Daniel O'Connell School started once again. It became a wonderful success, which is largely down to the work and the commitment of Junior. We wouldn't be gathered here today without him. It didn't stop there for Junior. He had a huge influence in the town of Cahirsiveen and the whole community of Ivara, of which he loved so very much. He gave of his time continuously, and indeed his family did, supporting him. With all these commitments, his love for education, history, the church, and of course the GAA, which are remembering him this evening. He also did tremendous work for so many charities. On our behalf, and everyone involved in the school, especially our committee here today, I wish to extend our thoughts to his beloved family. To Phil, we are thinking of you so, so much. To Paul, Vera, Emer and Linda, who always helped at the school, we miss you and we're thinking of you. John, Lydia, his beloved grandchildren, Sean and Mark, his sister Nuala and brother Peter. Be assured we will always remember Junior in all that we do. And the greatest tribute and the greatest legacy is to remember people with our love. There will be many wonderful stories told over the weekend. They will be shared about the impact Junior had on so many lives. I think it would be fitting now if we all stood and gave a minute's silence to our beloved friend. a rieshte greve anam allen úsel.
Thank you, Mary, for that very eloquent and full appreciation of our good friend, Junior Murphy. The last time I met Junior, which was the night before he died, we talked actually about the proceedings that we would put in place for this school, and whether or not it was an idea that we should proceed with it at all. And he said, of course we shall do it. We'll do it together. We'll pull together. He said, like we always did. I can remember that, those sort of fighting words that he would always come out with. So, of course, as Mary said, we remember him, but we also thank him for his leadership, and indeed thank all our supporters, the friends of the Daniel O'Connell School, who encouraged our committee to reconvene this year after an absence of 18 months or so. There are times, I must say, over the last few months when I thought it was maybe a bit mad to be doing this, but I'm glad that we did it because we have, of course, have our public guidelines which have been circulated by the government, you know, the need for social distancing, wearing masks, all that sort of thing. And again, I know somebody said to me yesterday, we're sick of hearing about these things, but I hope and pray and ask you to abide by them, particularly the social part of our proceedings and when we have coffee and lunch and so forth. Because if we do that, we can at least be part of the path back to normality. One of the things, of course, which the path to normality has encouraged the school to do, as Mary said, is to put the proceedings or to make them accessible online. Now, we've been talking about this for the last, I suppose, 2 or 3 years, if not more, but we always shied away from it, partly because I certainly don't understand that world. I'm not a techie at all. But of course, the pandemic encouraged us, maybe pushed us into considering that. So I'm glad to say that, as Mary said, the proceedings from Cahirsiveen today are being live streamed, and we welcome those who are watching these proceedings via the internet in other parts of Kerry, other parts of Ireland, and indeed far beyond. And I particularly want to welcome 2 people who I saw had registered from New Zealand. I don't know what time of the night or morning it's out there, but a very special welcome to you. Now, the proceedings tomorrow, unfortunately, we can't live stream them for technical reasons, but they are being recorded, and all of the proceedings will be accessible free on our website from, I think, Wednesday on, I think. So you can see them if you miss anything, especially those people, obviously, who haven't been able to come here for whatever reasons. So live streaming, of course, also means that we have to stick very rigidly to our timetable. So when we say we are convening at 11 o'clock, and breaking at 1 o'clock, that's what we don't mean 1:10. No, I hope we can actually do that, but that's the aim anyway. We hope to stick to the timetable because that's part of the arrangement we have with the live streaming people. So at this point, just one other thing I should mention, of course, and that is also to thank our sponsors, the Kerry County Council, Fáilte Ireland, Office of Public Works, and Dermot and Siobhan Walsh, who are down there, who've been supporting us from day one, of Super Value across the way there. Great value. Visit often and spend as much as you can. But they've always been great supporters of ours from day one. Willie Driscoll, the same. We didn't ask a lot of people for support this year because of the year that was in it, but we found actually people offering to help because of the expense involved. But they were very proactive, I must say, in approaching us, and I really was very touched by that. That brings me, of course, to our speakers. You know, nothing can be done without our speakers, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers. We invited our speakers several months ago. None of them turned us down, funnily enough. And that is, but having said that, I'd like to pay a special tribute and give a special welcome to our first speaker, Mr. Justice Frank Clarke, who arrived last night, who was giving his lecture and who is going back to Dublin immediately afterwards for a family engagement. So I don't know why somebody like him would do something like this, except that maybe it is the attraction of South Kerry or Daniel O'Connell, I don't know. But anyway, I'm very, very grateful to him for being here. Justice Clarke, as you know, was until a significant birthday 10 days ago, the Chief Justice of Ireland. Prior to that, of course, he served as a Supreme Court judge, and prior to that again was one of our more distinguished interpreters of commercial, public and constitutional law, which is an expertise he still has, of course, and I'm sure will put to good use over the months ahead and years ahead. He also is involved in any number of public fora. That expertise, again, caused him to give advice on a number of constitutional cases that were referred by the President for opinion to the Supreme Court. He has advised Oireachtas committees. He's involved in any number of things. But I'm glad to say that outside of this very busy life, he also has an active interest in the turf. And he's one of the stewards of the Turf Club, which is something some of you, I think, in this audience would appreciate. So he leads a very full life, both as a barrister, a jurist, a judge, and as an expert in all sorts of things. And as I said, not least in the turf, which is something I don't understand at all, but there you go. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Justice Frank Clarke, to speak on Ireland and the law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have to say it's great to speak to a live audience again, all suitably socially distant and wearing masks, but nonetheless here in the flesh, and also to those who have joined us remotely. I want to talk about a specific aspect of the law, which is the rule of law, a topic that is very much to the forefront in current times, its application in Ireland, but also within the European Union. And I'd hope at the end to perhaps bring it back in a slight way to the times of Daniel O'Connell, because I think some of the issues which were alive at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century and a bit thereafter are still alive in their own way today, and I think it's important to reflect on that. I might ask 4 questions about the rule of law. The first is, what is it? The second is, why does it matter? The third is, why is it in the news? And the fourth is, what are the challenges that it brings? It's the kind of term that's bandied around a lot. We've heard it even yesterday from the Taoiseach speaking after a European Council meeting. And I suppose most people have a fairly good knowledge in very general terms of what it means. It is that no one is above the law. That the law applies to government, it applies to the powerful, it applies to the courts and judges, and that all persons should be considered equal before the law. And that's a kind of an easy aspirational thing that everyone would be in favor of. It's one of those terms like democracy that no one can be against. But there are often debates about precisely what it means in particular circumstances. And the debate, for example, around democracy is often a debate about what people say democracy means. You can't be against democracy. So if what someone else says is democratic isn't something you agree with, you then disagree with whether that's really democratic. And I think the rule of law is a bit the same. There are debates around the edges about exactly what it means. And I'd like to just briefly touch on some of those because I think they are relevant to our position in Ireland today and the wider European context. I think the statement that the rule of law simply means that no one is above the law, that the law applies to everyone, is fine in theory. But if one thinks it through, I think it needs some refinement. And it's probably that kind of refinement that can never have an absolutely red line that neatly boxes it in, and it will get a little fuzzy around the edges. But many great theories do end up being a bit like that. For example, what if you control how the laws are made? If the powerful can actually influence to an undue degree the way in which laws are formulated, then does mere box ticking in compliance with the law, is that enough? Because if you can change the law to suit your own interests, then saying you're complying with the new law which you have thus fashioned is hardly a great advance for those who might be disadvantaged by that. So most would, I think, now take the view that it must mean something more than mere technical compliance with each of the rules, as it were, that are in force for the time being, that it carries with it some basic principles that must be present. I recall it was mentioned a number of times in the context of my recent retirement, but I was very lucky as a very young barrister to have become involved in one of the major constitutional cases of the mid-1970s, when I was only 2 or 3 years in practice, a case called Healy and Donoghue, which most lawyers would be familiar with. It was a case which established the constitutional entitlement of those charged with significant criminal offences to legal aid if they couldn't provide their own. But there was also a philosophical or theoretical element to that case, which is, I think, still of relevance today. The Irish Constitution says that no one should be imprisoned save in due course of law, a phrase very similar to the due process provision in the United States Constitution. And the United States Supreme Court had interpreted the due process provision as not just encompassing technical compliance with the rules of the day, as it were, but also basic concepts of fairness. And luckily, we managed to persuade the Supreme Court of the day to take a similar view of the due course of law provision in the Irish Constitution. And I think that has an echo in the rule of law debate today. It's not just about technically complying with the statute book, as it were, box ticking, if you will. It is about more basic fairness. And it does require, perhaps, that there be mechanisms in place to ensure that the rule of law is enforced. Courts, independent courts, are clearly a big part of that. One of the themes which I returned to a number of times during my term as Chief Justice was the concept of access to justice, the ability of people to have an effective way of enforcing their rights or defending themselves if they're on the wrong side of litigation. And I often commented that, well, perhaps not everyone agrees with every law that we have, and not everyone agrees with every decision that every court makes. But even if we have pretty good laws and pretty good courts, that doesn't avail people very much if they can't have reasonable access to those courts to vindicate their rights or ensure that their position is protected. And I think in the context of the rule of law, it would be all very well if in theory government or the rich and powerful were subject to the same laws as everyone else, if there weren't effective means of enforcing that. So our system is far from perfect in that regard, in my view. The law is often said to be available to the very poor and the very rich. The very poor because cost orders against them don't matter too much, the very rich because they can afford it. And the system for those in between is often not that accessible. So we are far from perfect in that regard. But I think that's an element of the rule of law. It's not just a theory, it's about practice. Can those who might try and avoid being subject to the law be able to avoid it simply because there's no means of enforcement? And I think there are also soft power elements to the rule of law, a free and independent and diverse media, which holds people to account and ensures that the laws are respected by all, is an important part. A free and diverse academic community that can comment on perceived problems with the rule of law is a huge part. And we come to a moment, those countries where the rule of law is under particular threat. But it is interesting that it's not just the courts that the powerful seek to capture, but it's also the media and, to an extent, the academic community. So I would see the rule of law as a diverse set of measures which allows for the avoidance of absolute power vesting in one group. The old phrase, if power corrupts, then absolute power corrupts absolutely, is, I think, very true. And if we don't have mechanisms that stop absolute power, then there is no rule of law, even if, in theory, everyone, no matter how powerful, is subject to the rule of law. So then the question is, why does it matter? Why does it matter to us? And why, perhaps, are we also legitimately interested in how the rule of law is applied in other countries? Last Saturday, I had the honor of addressing a conference in the University of Warsaw that was held in honor of a good friend of mine, Professor Mirosław Wojciechowski, former judge of the Polish Supreme Court, or Polish Constitutional Court. A book had been put together of essays by lawyers and judges, academic and practical, around Europe in his honor. And the theme of my address, which I'd like to sort of reprise with an Irish angle this morning, was, well, why is it any of our business as to whether the rule of law in Poland is being obeyed? And my answer really started with the day I was called to the bar in 1973, when Ireland had, that very January, joined what was then the European Economic Community. And at that time, European law was regarded as a very specialist area that a few clever people over in the corner of the room knew something about. And if by some mischance you happened to need to know about it, you went and asked one of them. But no one thought it was going to be a big part of their day-to-day life, whether they were practicing lawyers, whether they were judges. Even in universities, it was, for example, not a core subject. Some people maybe studied it in the immediate run-up to Irish accession. But that has now radically changed. And just to give one very simple example, in 2013, we passed the 33rd Amendment to the Constitution, which created a new tier of court, the Court of Appeal. And that meant that the Supreme Court, instead of having to deal with all appeals from the High Court, now only deals with the most important cases. And like the Supreme Court in, for example, the United States or the United Kingdom, we probably hear 70 to 80 cases a year, but they are picked as meeting a high threshold of general importance. So an interesting question is, what kind of cases reach that threshold nowadays? Criminal cases will be the largest single group, perhaps on average about 20% of the total caseload each year. But the three next in almost every year are three areas of law that are very heavily influenced by European Union law. One is environmental law, which isn't exclusively European Union, but is very heavily influenced by European Union law. And in fact, most of the really controversial cases that make it to the Supreme Court would very much depend on European Union law. Second are European arrest warrants. We have abolished within the European Union the traditional extradition, and there is now a form of order issued by the courts of one country requiring the surrender of someone to that country for the purposes of either being tried or serving a sentence if they've already been tried. And that is completely a creature of European Union law. And the third area that regularly comes before the Supreme Court is immigration, which is again very heavily influenced by European Union law, with various directives and regulations specifying the circumstances in which immigration, asylum applications or applications for international protection are to be dealt with. And that similar situation pervades throughout all of our courts. We have European rules on which courts have the final say in respect of various types of cases, and those rules have to be obeyed. For example, and I think this stems from the very nature of the European Union, free movement both of business and of people means that there's a lot more interaction. We now know that it's 20% of the population of Ireland were not born in Ireland. And by definition, those people will get married either to other people not born in Ireland or to people born in Ireland. And some of those marriages will run into trouble, and there'll be family law proceedings, and they will have a cross-border element. There'll be children, and there'll be issues about where they are to go, who is to have primary custody, and again, they have cross-border elements. Business of its nature, when people are selling goods from one member state to another, disputes arise from time to time, companies go bust, there are insolvency rules. All of these are heavily influenced now by European Union law. And what that means is that the average Irish court on a regular basis is confronted, is perhaps not the right word, but has to deal with the fact that it is being asked to enforce some order made by a court in another member state. It may be that that court has sought the surrender of someone to be prosecuted in that state. It may be that the European Union rules say that the courts of that country are to be the courts that are to finally determine that issue, and the Irish courts have to follow that. And we really have to do that with very limited exceptions, and there's a good reason for that. If each country's courts could make their own minds up and come to different conclusions, you would have legal chaos. Which is to prevail. The Irish courts say the kids should go with the husband. The Spanish courts say the kids should go with the wife. And what happens if the kids are in Germany, and what's the German court to do? Is it to follow the Irish court or the German court? If you don't have rules for that, you have chaos. And the reason we have rules is so that there should be order. And even within our own legal system, and legal systems differ, but they all have somewhere where the road ends. There has to be some court within your system that has the final say. And when you get there and you lose, that is, with very few exceptions, the end of the road. And the international equivalent of that within the European Union is there has to be the courts of some country which has the final say, and everyone else has to accept that. And I would perhaps go even a little further and say has to accept it, even if you don't fully agree with the judgment that you're being asked to respect. Just as I was that soldier once, you were a High Court judge and the Supreme Court says you were wrong. Well, you're entitled to take the view the Supreme Court are wrong and you are right, but you still have to respect the fact that in our legal order, the Supreme Court say is final over the High Court, and you have to follow through on that. And just in the same way that you might think, I wouldn't have decided that case in Germany the same way as that German judge did, but the rules say that German judgment is to be the definitive judgment in that dispute, then you have to obey it. But what does that carry with it? I think people don't mind that, provided that you are happy that the court system in the country whose orders you are being required to enforce is independent and is fair in general terms. It doesn't have to be right. It may not even have the highest quality of judges known to the world, but at least if it's fair and honest, then the system requires for it to work that you have to comply with it. But if you are being asked to enforce orders from another country where there are real doubts about whether the orders being made in that country are truly being made by independent judges, then I think that raises much more serious questions, because that has the potential to even bring our own courts into disrepute. If we are constantly seen to be enforcing orders or conceding jurisdiction to the courts of another country where there's real questions about whether that other country has an independent court system, then that reflects back on us and potentially brings us into some level of disrepute. So the thesis which I put forward last week in Warsaw was that it is for that very reason that it is our business to consider the position in other countries. As long as we have a system where we have to enforce in one way or another, or concede jurisdiction in one way or another to courts in other member states of the European Union, then what happens in the courts in those other countries is our business, because it affects us. And it's not just a question of us not really having a legitimate business in how other countries organize their own affairs. So that leads to, I suppose, the third question which I posed, which is, why is it in the news? Yesterday, as I understand it, reading reports this morning, the European Council, the body of prime ministers, spent over 2 hours debating the situation in Poland. And why is that so? And as I understand it, again, our own Taoiseach was one of the more outspoken attenders at that meeting, and spoke both within the meeting and publicly outside the meeting on the issue, I think describing some elements of the situation in Poland as a slap in the face. But it is worth perhaps just looking a little at the detail of what the problem is, because I think one does need to be careful. Many countries within the European Union have different legal structures. I suppose we're all inclined to think when we start off that the rest look a bit like ours. They don't always look a bit like ours, but many of them work perfectly well, even though they might seem strange to us. So let me just give an example. In the countries of what's called the common law world, the sort of English-American system of law, there is normally a single Supreme Court at the top, which deals with everything. That's the system we have, system the United States has, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the like. But most continental countries have a separate constitutional court or tribunal, which isn't the same court that deals with ordinary cases. So the final court of appeal in a criminal case in France is not the same court as the court that deals with constitutional issues. And indeed, many of the countries have separate streams of courts for what's called public law issues involving what we would call judicial review, cases involving challenges to decisions of state bodies. If, for example, in France, you wanted to challenge a planning permission, you would go to a totally different type of court than if it was a criminal case or a civil case. So countries have very different systems. And even who constitutes the body that decides constitutional issues can be very different and can seem alien to us, but perfectly normal to others. So we do need to be careful. I could just give two examples. A couple of years ago, I was part of a seminar in DCU, which was attended, and I shared a platform with a senior judge of the Italian Constitutional Court, and Italy has an entirely separate constitutional tribunal. That judge was a former prime minister of Italy, who was now acting as a judge of their constitutional tribunal, Judge Amato. And I learned that there are 15 judges of the Italian Constitutional Tribunal. 5 are appointed by the president, 5 are elected by the parliament, and 5 are elected by the senior, what I might call ordinary judiciary. Now that would seem very strange to us. It would be strange to us if there was something separate from the Supreme Court for constitutional cases, and Michael D nominated 5 of them, and 5 were the subject of some horse trading in Leinster House, and the other 5 were appointed from the forecourts. That would sound very strange to us, but then what we do probably sounds strange to the Italians. Likewise, the Conseil Constitutionnel of France is elected in a different way again, but its current president, the sort of Chief Justice in that limited sense for constitutional purposes, is Laurent Fabius, a former Prime Minister of France. So again, systems are different, and it is dangerous to say, well, it just doesn't look like what we're used to, and therefore it's a breach of the rule of law. I think we need to respect the fact that there are many different legal cultures, many different legal structures, and potentially they can all work very well in their own way, and maybe suit the historical traditions of that country better than a model like ours might do. And of course, even our kind of system with a single Supreme Court at the top can run into difficulties, as you can see from the current situation in the United States, where the appointment of the Supreme Court has become a hugely political issue, with, I think, a significant reduction, if recent opinion polls are to be believed, in public respect for the Supreme Court in the United States. So saying that it just doesn't look like the one we're used to isn't enough. But there are, I think, some more fundamental problems, particularly about what's happening in Poland. And if you take most of them in isolation, they perhaps can be explained. But when you put them all together, I think it gives a very dangerous picture. For a start, the retirement age of judges was reduced by 5 years. Very unusually, I think uniquely in my experience in certainly the developed world, that was applied retrospectively to currently serving judges. We, for example, reduced the age from 72 to 70 sometime in the late 1990s. But the reduction didn't apply to anyone who was already a judge at the time of the reduction. And indeed, until a few years ago, I think my immediate predecessor as Chief Justice, Susan Denham, was the last. People were still serving to 72 because they had been appointed judges before that reduction took place. So, the right age for judges to retire is a matter for legitimate debate. Personally, I think it could go back up again a bit. I think most of us 70-year-olds are fairly serviceable, though I don't really care about it too much anymore, really, to some extent. And there's a proposal, for example, in the UK, who brought it down from 75 to 70 a while ago to put it back up again to 75, because there's a feeling you're losing experienced people who would be happy to keep going. That's a perfectly legitimate debate. What's the right age? It's the usual thing, you know, the analogy with redundancies. You have a voluntary redundancy scheme, and all the people you'd like to keep are the ones who take it because they can get the money and go get another job, and all the ones you'd wish would go always stay because they know they can't get another job. And there'll be a fear that you might get something like that with judges as well. But anyway, of course you can have a perfectly good debate about what's the right age for judges to retire. It's a bit more dodgy, I think, if you apply it retrospectively, with the real suspicion that the reason behind it is not just a decision that it's better that judges retire at 65 rather than 70, but rather that you want to get rid of a whole swathe of judges and replace them with ones who are more to the thinking of the government. Almost all systems have some form of conduct tribunal or disciplinary body for judges. Ours is very embryonic at the moment. The Judicial Council is only in the course of getting up and running, but we will have a proper conduct committee and complaint system operational by the middle of next year. So again, there's nothing wrong with that in principle. But again, where you create a special disciplinary body where the judges who sit on it and who have the power to discipline their colleagues are selected not by judges but by the Parliament, again, perhaps selected with a view to doing down judges who aren't doing what the government thinks they should be doing, that becomes an issue. And there are a range of other measures which have been adopted in Poland, which collectively, I think, can legitimately be seen to be an attempt by the government to capture the judiciary, to get rid of judges they don't like, to replace them with judges they do like, to allow other cases previously decided to be reopened. And again, you need to be careful about that. All systems have some possibility for reopening old cases. We can reopen criminal convictions on miscarriage of justice grounds or where major new evidence emerges. Civil cases can be reopened if it can be credibly suggested that the judgment was procured by some fraud. But we have very tight rules on that because bringing litigation to an end is important. And if people could constantly reopen cases, those who had successfully won their case would be subjected to unreasonable continuing litigation. So again, a reopening is not in itself a problem, but where it's designed to reverse judgments the government didn't like, then it becomes more problematic. And when you put all of those together, I think you get to a situation where there is a very real question about the independence of the judiciary in Poland. Hence the fact that the European Court of Justice has been engaged regularly in litigation, either brought by the Commission, alleging that Poland is in breach of its obligations under the treaties, or involving national courts, such as, first off, the Irish courts, asking questions of the European Court about whether it is, for example, permissible to surrender people for trial in a country where there are real questions about the independence of the judiciary. And that's an area that's still in some difficulty. And it was just personally interesting and interesting to the audience in Warsaw last week that I was able to say, I mean, this isn't just a theory, this is a real thing. On my flight over to Warsaw last Friday, in the back of the plane, there were two policemen and a Polish gentleman who was being surrendered to Poland for trial in Poland. So now I assume that was assessed, I don't know who the individual was, whether there was litigation in Ireland about it. And I'm sure if there was a real issue about whether that individual's trial would be fair, he wouldn't have been surrendered. But it does show this isn't just a theoretical thing. Real people are being sent to be tried in courts. And if there are real questions about the independence of the courts to which they are being surrendered, then that is, I think, is a problem for us as well. So I think that's why it's in the news, that we are intimately involved in dealing on a regular basis with the courts of other member states. We have to deal with them. The European legal space requires that we do deal with them. We therefore have to have a legitimate interest in whether those courts are operating properly. And therefore, that is why it is a major issue at a European level at the moment. But I suppose it's easy to kind of say, well, this is our problem only because they have a problem. Do we potentially have problems ourselves? I would say at the moment, not particularly, but I do think it is something we always need to be careful about. It's easy to be complacent. My wife teaches politics in Trinity, and her particular area of expertise is actually the transition to democracy from the Eastern European bloc of countries, and in particular Poland, which I suppose by osmosis, I've had an interest in Poland over the last 40 odd years. But if you go back to, say, around the time when those former Soviet countries in Eastern Europe were joining the European Union, Poland would have been regarded as perhaps the one that was most advanced towards an orderly, typical democratic liberal democracy. And yet it's now that perhaps along with Hungary is the country about which there is the most concern. So things can change quite quickly. And the fact that you might be grand today doesn't mean that you'll be grand in 20 years' time. And therefore, I think we do need to look at what are the challenges, what causes a challenge to the rule of law. I don't think there's a single answer. Sometimes it is the legal structure. Sometimes it's historical facts, the fact that, for example, there is still suspicion in some of those Eastern European countries about lawyers who trained in the communist period, some who were judges in the communist period. It's important to remember that in most of continental Europe, unlike the system in Ireland and the UK and America, becoming a judge is a kind of career move taken at an early stage. You qualify as a law graduate, you go to judge school, and you move your way up however far you get through the judicial ranks, unlike the system we have where people practice as lawyers for many years, are normally very experienced, typically late 40s, early 50s when they're appointed. So a lot of the judiciary in Eastern European countries may well have started their career prior to the collapse of communism. That's becoming less so as the gap between then and now expands. And different countries took different approaches as to whether they got rid of judges. I remember being told that in Latvia, what they did was they got rid of half the judges. I didn't quite follow how they chose the half to get rid of, but they appointed new judges for the other half of posts. So there was a kind of a mix, and there was a kind of feeling that that had worked in its own way. So there are legacy issues, I suppose, which we maybe do not share. But I personally think that the overriding threat to the rule of law comes from the political system, where governments do not like the dissipation of power among various entities. That is perhaps the characteristic, I would think, of a liberal democracy, that there are courts which exercise formal control over whether legislation is constitutional or not and can strike it down if it's not, that there are independent media and an independent academy that can comment on it and control it, that you dissipate power so that no one source has power. If you get a political model that really doesn't like that doesn't like being told you can't do this, and then tries to capture the entity that is saying you can't do this by, for example, getting rid of a lot of judges and putting in new ones who will do their bidding, then I think that is the real problem. And that's perhaps where I come back to where does Daniel O'Connell come into all of this? Well, it's not quite Daniel O'Connell, but it's someone who was an Irish barrister more or less at the same time, perhaps fractionally before Daniel O'Connell. As I understand it, Daniel O'Connell was called to the bar in May of that famous year, 1798. John Philpot Curran was another famous Irish barrister of roughly the same era. And a speech which he made, I think in 1790, is credited with being the source of the famous phrase that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Perhaps a more modern take on the same point, if you're at least modern, if you're my age, is a phrase from that great song by Joni Mitchell, which said that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think that's true of things like the rule of law. We have it, and we probably won't know what we had unless it disappears. And the way to stop it disappearing is by exercising eternal vigilance. So I think there is an echo from the issues of despotism, which were very much alive in that period when the French Revolution was afoot, in today. It's not the same. People aren't losing their heads in the square in Warsaw at the moment, but nonetheless, it is the same general kind of risk that you have a singular power which can exercise despotic power if it's let, and that the only way to prevent it is by exercising eternal vigilance. So while our picture is relatively rosy, in my opinion, at the moment, we're not perfect. There's a lot that needs to be done to make it better. It's at least reasonably okay, but that could change, and we then might then miss that which we now have. So the motto is, we need to exercise eternal vigilance. Thank you very much.
Now, Judge Clarke will take a few questions. If any of you want to ask a question, there are two microphones. One is here and one is here. So I'd ask you to go there. We don't have a roving mic, but we have two mics set up there. Does anybody have a question? Don't be shy. Paddy, do you want to? If you would just go back to the microphone there.
If, as Chief Justice, you had received an invitation to yesterday's church service in Armagh, would you have felt there was any constitutional obstacle to accepting the invitation?
Well, judges are meant to be decisive, so I'll give a straight answer. I wouldn't personally have felt there was a problem with going. Would I have gone? I'm not sure. But I certainly wouldn't have felt there was any formal, legal, constitutional reason why I couldn't go. You obviously sometimes have to take into account the optics of things as well. I mean, there's two layers. One is, as a judge, should you be going to things like that? But we do. We go to, as members of the Council of State, for example, we go to the National Day of Commemoration. So that kind of commemorative event is something judges attend. So I don't see any reason in principle why judges shouldn't go. I suspect as a practical person, I would have rung up my dear friend, the Lord Chief Justice, or now the new Lady Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, to see whether he or she was going. If they were going, I might have gone. If they weren't going, I probably wouldn't have gone.
Stick together.
Decisive but cowardly is perhaps the answer.
Are there any other questions? Could you just go to the microphone there, please? Thank you. It's just here.
Judge Clarke, thank you for those interesting words about the history of our concept of justice. And one of the foundation states of the concept of the rule of law and of democracy is the United Kingdom. But yet they don't have a separation of power philosophy embedded in their regime. Instead, they have this concept called parliamentary sovereignty, which recently was highlighted. And I was wondering whether you'd like to make any comments about that.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I think as time has gone on, I've seen different systems that do things that shouldn't work actually working. And I've seen systems that do things that should work not working. So I've become less of a structuralist and more of a person who just looks at, does it work? Now, there might be some who say in just the last few years, aspects of the United Kingdom aren't working. But I mean, they do have a fairly independent judiciary. They've done a lot of things in recent times that the government doesn't like. There are proposals to rein in the power of the courts in England, and that'll be a very interesting debate. But they do seem to actually have an independent judiciary who call the government to account. I do recall once being told a story, whether it was exaggerated or not, I'm not sure, but it was an English delegation going to China at a time when China was reorganizing its legal system. And they said that they were going to have as the senior judge in their Supreme Court a member of the Politburo or the cabinet. And the English said, well, we think that's a very strange model and it's not normal to do that. And the Chinese said, well, that's surprising because we modeled it on your view of the Lord Chancellor, who sits in cabinet and is also the senior judge. So, you know, I'm inclined to think that you look at the results rather than the theory. There are various different systems that seem to work. The United Kingdom might be one that comes under challenge in the near future. I mean, if they do really roll back on the extent to which people can challenge the lawfulness of state decisions in the courts, I think that would be a significant blow to the rule of law in the United Kingdom. I remember speaking to one very senior English judge who said to me that, you know, Frank, really, the sort of right wing of the Tory party think that all the bad decisions are made in Luxembourg and Brussels, and a lot of them don't know the difference between Luxembourg and Brussels. That's true too. But actually, most of the ones they don't really like are made by the courts in England, and maybe they're beginning to realise that. So I'd say watch this space. In 5 years' time, we could be having a real debate about just how firm the rule of law is in a country like the United Kingdom. I mean, you get a slightly populist government, or maybe even quite a populist government, depending on your perspective, that becomes perhaps a bigger risk.
Okay, we can take one more, maybe. Does anybody have a final question? No? Okay, well, look, it is 5 to 11 in any event, and if I'm to stick to the rules that I outlined for myself at the beginning, we will finish. So can I thank Judge Clarke for his very eloquent and very wide-ranging and provocative reflections on Ireland and the rule of law. And of course, there are a lot of connotations, as Judge Clarke pointed out, with the career of O'Connell, which is something maybe we might take up on a future occasion, because I don't think you can consider O'Connell without considering the concept of rule of law and perhaps how it evolved in that particular historical context. So again, can I thank Justice Clarke for his remarks, and thank you for being here. Now, again, just to say that the program, according to the program here, we are breaking for coffee between 11 and 11:30, resuming sharply at 11:30. And again, I'd ask you please to observe the social distancing that I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you very much.
I think we're all very well refreshed after that. Thank you. You're all very welcome back to the next speaker in the next session here. So the topic is approaches to Kerry history. The speaker, Professor Nicholas Canny, who's going to speak to it, and we'll be inviting questions afterwards. But we're strictly sticking to the timeline because Murish has us very well warned. So without further ado, can I welcome Nicholas to the stand?
Thank you, June. I'm speaking from notes. I'm not sure how the 40 minutes will go, but June will cut me short, and anything I don't cover, I'll answer in the questions. These last couple of years have been particularly important for Kerry history, in that there have been a sequence of books published on Kerry history, culminating in Kerry History and Society, which Maurice Brick edited and which was published last year. When we look back in time, when we look to the years 1871 to 1874, we find that that was also a particularly fertile period, and that I'll be concentrating on two women historians who published books in that particular interlude. M.F. Cusack, A History of the Kingdom of Kerry, which was published in 1871, and Mary Agnes Hickson, Selections of Old Kerry Records, which were published in 1872 and 1874. These two women were almost identical in age, in that they died in the same year, 1899. One of them was born in 1825 and the other was born in 1829, so it was only a 4-year difference between them. Morris, when he approached me, asked me to give a talk on M.F. Cusack, the Nun of Kenmare. And my response was that you could only understand the Nun of Kenmare and what her arguments were if you knew what Mary Hickson was about at the same time. That there were bitter rivals, and effectively what each wrote was fed of what the other had said. We can begin, but each also believed that they had a vocation to be historian, and each wrote effectively recognizing that the society in which they were living was changing very rapidly, and that they wanted to advocate the position of a particular group within that society, hoping that there would be a future for them in the changing world and in the changing Ireland and in the changing Kerry that they were familiar with. So we will begin with Mary Hickson, because Mary Hickson was a Kerry woman. She was born in Tralee, the daughter of a Protestant solicitor, and effectively seemed to have made her living from being a historian before there were any emoluments which would keep historians really in existence. She always seems to have a marginal financial existence. But she and the family were closely related with the Protestant ascendancy of the time, and particularly with the Denny family, who had dominated the town of Tralee for hundreds of years. And she was particularly associated, as was her father, with Archdeacon Rowan, or Archdeacon Blennerhassett Rowan, who was a dignitary in the Church of Ireland, but also was dedicated much of his life to the antiquities of Kerry and to writing Kerry records, and particularly looking at the position of Protestants within Kerry society. This was a matter which was important to him because he was 30 years younger than Mary Hickson, who worked with him from quite an early age. But he also recognized that society was changing, and it was not changing for the better as far as the Protestant community of Kerry was concerned. That the Protestant community represented only about 4% of the entire county, the entire county's population in the 19th century. And this was a segment of the population which had dominated society if you look back 50 years previously. And their dominance was changing for a variety of reasons. And first of all, the position of the Church of Ireland within society had been challenged even through the 18th century, particularly for its basic source of income, which came from the payment of tithe. The tithe had been contested by illegal groups in the 18th century and was then continued to be challenged during the tithe war of the early part of the 19th century, up to 1871, when government decreed that the Church of Ireland would be disestablished. The disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, that is, no longer recognizing the Church of Ireland as being the official church of the state, was particularly painful for Protestants within Ireland because the church in England was not disestablished at the same time. It was kind of a unique punishment for the Protestant, the established church in Ireland. That was one loss of power. Equally well, loss of political power. The group who had dominated politics in Ireland through the 18th century were being increasingly challenged by the demand for Catholic emancipation, which was finally conceded by O'Connell. But not only the passing of Catholic emancipation, another major challenge was that political reform was being proceeded with in Britain and was being extended into Ireland. One of the major issues of political reform was the extension of the franchise. So that the more the franchise was increased, the more, we're only talking about a male franchise, but the more the franchise was extended as it was progressively over the 19th century. There was a reluctance always on the part of Ireland to conform with this. And O'Connell, while he lived, always wanted Ireland to be in step with what was happening in Britain as far as the franchise was concerned, but this means that Protestants were increasingly less likely to be elected under the extension franchise was taking place. Another factor was the Great Famine. The famine was not caused by Irish landlords. Many Irish landlords were bankrupt as a consequence of the famine because of the rates that a poor law rate was increased. But popularly, the propagandists on the nationalist side managed to convey the impression that landlords had been negligent in some way and that they had been the cause of the famine. And to a large degree, that idea was also instilled into the political opinion within Britain itself, so that in that sense, the political support which Protestants in Ireland would have expected to come from Britain was being eroded. And then there were, in the 19th century, particularly coming up to the 1870s, which you're talking about, there were increasing issues in relation to land agitation, demands on the part of tenants for a betterment of their position relative to that of the owners of property itself. So that all of this group challenged the position of Protestants, and to some degree, Rowan and his associates, and Hickson continuing in that, were writing, encouraging people to write history at the county level, first of all, to encourage people to take pride in their county community. But also they were interested in writing of county history because they kept away from the controversial issues relating to the writing of grand narrative, which was written at the national level, but also because the county essentially was an institution of English creation, and it was at the county level that the Protestant proprietors had dominated and had asserted their political influence over historical period of time. And it was within the counties and baronies that they had been involved in grand juries, and in that sense could demonstrate by writing history how their segment of the population had contributed to the political life and to the improvement of community. And I come to the term improvement in that insofar as people in the 19th century, and I'm talking now about Protestant people in the 19th century, had a model for the writing of county history, it would have been that provided from the 18th century by Charles Smith and his associates, who had written a sequence of county histories. And Smith had written particularly the ancient and present state of Waterford, Cork, and latterly Kerry. It was the last of the three Munster counties that he had written about. Charles Smith came from the town of Lismore, and he lived under the shadow of Lismore Castle, so to speak, and was very much beholden to the patronage which was available there through the Boyle family. And that the model that Smith was writing on is that he sent out questionnaires, or he travelled to the counties himself, identified the principal landed families in each county, and organised his histories of identifying the natural resources of the counties, and then explaining how the potential that these resources presented had been improved as a consequence of the activities of the landed families who had come into the possession of property through the 17th and 18th centuries. And that he was particularly in praise of Sir Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork, who was responsible or the principal beneficiary of plantation of Munster in the 16th century, extending into the 17th century. But he wrote with equal praise of his son, Roger Boyle, the first Earl of Orrery, who effectively had taken over control of Munster in the aftermath of the Cromwellian settlement of the country. So that in that sense, he identified improvement with the change of ownership of land coming into Protestant possession. And that the improvement of land, and by improvement he meant the development of towns, the development of the houses which the landlords had, ornamental gardens, the development of industry, roads, bridges, charity schools, etc., that all of these physical symbols of improvement was effectively what he was enumerating, and that he was indicating what further improvement could be made. When it came to Kerry, Smith seems to have become somewhat exhausted, and that he did say that Kerry that had come into Protestant possession at the time of the Munster plantation, or much of the county had, that this coincided with the development of plantation in the province of Ulster, which had led to the improvement of that province. And then he doesn't do the survey, the detailed survey of who owned what and where and what detailed improvements had occurred throughout the county at large. And he kind of concludes it by saying that William Petty had come into possession of a good deal of land in the county at the end of the 17th century, and the world was a better place as a consequence of that, without going into any specific details. And so then in that sense, the writing of Kerry's history had been improperly done as far as Rowan was concerned, and that Rowan and his associates seem to have wanted to write or improve upon what Smith had done. And indeed, Maurice Brick tells me that some years ago there was an annotated copy of Smith's History of Kerry, which had been in the possession of Rowan and which went in an auction somewhere. But quite clearly, we don't know where that has gone now. But in that sense, the detailed notes which Rowan would have written on that indicated where this might have been improved upon. And it was quite clearly the project of Rowan which he never completed. And the project of Hickson, which he inherited, was to write this model history of County Kerry as Smith should have done it some time before. And that this never comes into being. Instead of that, we get these two volumes that I mentioned, the records from Old Kerry Records, which he does publish in 1872 and 1874. Some of these records are records which he had compiled herself. More of them were records which Rowan had compiled. Some of them were bits and pieces which she and Rowan had together published while Rowan was still alive or after Rowan had died. And more of them were some of her own composition. But really they are notes rather than a comprehensive history of Kerry that she had visualized. And that we get this disparate type of history writing effectively because what she had wanted to do had been preempted by Cusack, who, as we said, published this volume called The Kingdom of Kerry in 1871. And in that sense, preempted what she herself would have wanted to have done. But it's not only that she preempted, it's not only that she stole her thunder, but as Hickson would have seen it, that Cusack had cheated, because Cusack had entered into correspondence with Rowan's son, Captain Rowan, and had negotiated from him a copy of all of Rowan's file of material which he had built up through his life, and had identified the arguments which Rowan was coming forward with, which were Hickson's arguments, and in her history of the Kingdom of Kerry countered these arguments. So it's not so much that she stole the thunder of Hickson, is that she quenched Hickson's thunder by putting forward the counter arguments before she had published them herself. So that Hickson essentially publishes her two-volume series because she is providing the documentary evidence to support the arguments that she had favored. These arguments being that effectively Protestant landowners in Kerry had been improvers consistently of society over time, that she was countering the argument that the landowners by definition were Cromwellians and were people of low social origin. She did this by identifying families like the Denneys and the Blennerhassetts and the Crosbys, indicating that all of these were people of high social standing in Elizabethan England, and that some of them even had positions of prominence in the court of Henry VIII, and that some of them had wives who had been courtiers with Queen Elizabeth. In that sense, these were no mean people. These were people from the upper echelons of English society. and they had been in the county since the 16th century, and that these were no arrivistes, that these were well-established part of the county community. But they also belonged, she claimed, and here is the novelty of her work, is that she places a great emphasis on genealogy, and she traces the extent to which the incoming Protestant landowning families in the county had intermarried with the pre-existing landowning families, both those of Anglo-Norman descent and those of Gaelic descent. So that there was practically none of the Protestant landed families that didn't have O'Sullivan or McCarthy or de Lacy blood in their veins. And in that sense, that they were all part of the one single community. And she said that this factor of intermarriage had communicated even to the lower echelons of society, and that she herself had O'Sullivan blood in her veins, which she was equally proud of as she was that of the Hicksons and the Days, her mother being a Day, and the Days being one of the principal clerical dynasties in the Church of Ireland and the Ardfert diocese. So that Cusack had countered some of these arguments, and that we now have to give you some indication of who Cusack was. I don't know how my time is going, but we're okay. The Cusack came from a Protestant, dysfunctional Protestant family in Dublin, in that her parents split up. Her mother brought her to England and had her educated in England, and she knew the English West Country very well, and that she was sent to an expensive boarding school. And during her education there, she had become interested in, very taken with matters spiritual, and she had become a nun in the Church of England. And in the convent, she was unhappy with the men who were provided to provide spiritual guidance to the sisters within the convent itself. She didn't think they were leading particularly godly lives, and that she also became interested in the controversy that was developing in 19th century Britain, known as the Oxford Movement, which is effectively to redecide what Protestantism was all about, the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, and recognizing that a split had occurred and that some of the Church of England people, particularly John Henry Newman, had left the Church of England and had become Catholics. She became attracted by this movement and leaves the Protestant Church and becomes a Catholic nun. And in England, she joins an English order. But in her new status as a nun in a Catholic convent, she got to know Mary O'Hagan, whose father was the Lord Chief Justice of Ireland, and who was involved with the Poor Clare Convent in Newry in County Down. And through Mary O'Hagan, she becomes a Poor Clare nun, and she moves to Newry. And then Mary O'Hagan moves from Newry and becomes the founder of a convent in Kenmare, and she moves to Kenmare with her. Now, Cusack is a very unusual Poor Clare nun, in that she negotiated, well, first of all, she seems to have regarded herself as socially superior to most of her fellow sisters, and that Mary O'Hagan was the only one that she seemed to regard as an equal with herself, but she at least was her Reverend Mother, and from whom she negotiated special terms, that instead of leading the enclosed life of a Poor Clare, that she was offered a special position, exempt from the normal rules of the convent, a special position to function as a full-time historian. And that she maintained an extensive correspondence, mostly with men, a large number of members of the Royal Irish Academy, and with people in England as well. And that she accumulated negotiated lots of loans of books into the convent and newspapers, and was therefore conversant with current politics and was interested in writing history. And it was through this correspondence that she corresponded with Rowan, who of course was a Protestant, and negotiated with Rowan that his father's documents would be made available to her that she could work on. And therefore she was using his material for the benefit of writing a county history. Now, before she wrote her history of Kerry, she already had become famous by publishing an illustrated history of Ireland, which appeared in print in 1868. This is an extraordinary piece of work in that it is a Catholic grand narrative of Irish history using illustration, but particularly concentrated on schools. She wanted this book to be sold in Irish Catholic schools and colleges, including the schools which were then just being established by the Presentation and Mercy nuns, because she felt that women up to now had been fed on novels and that history was going to be lead to their improvement. But she was particularly concerned that the Irish Catholic youth, and here she was talking about men, would be given reason to become proud in the achievements of their ancestors, because studying British history, which they were required to do, which is the only history available up to then, they were made feel ashamed of the country that they had come from. And there was a danger that in the future employment, being ashamed of their country, they would become ashamed of their religion. She was recognizing that a large number of Irish people were going to make their careers outside Ireland itself. They were going to make their careers in Britain and in the British Empire. And she was particularly concerned with those who were going to seek employment as functionaries within the British Empire and within the white empire of settlement overseas. So that in that sense, she and Hickson are not very different from each other in that they both believed in Ireland remaining part of Britain. The difference was that she was critical of the role of landlords within society, so that in her illustrated history, not only did she write this grand narrative, but in the preface, she wrote a critique of landlords, particularly in the Kenmare area, and she compared the extent to which landlords functioned as supporters of their community to which Irish landlords, relative to English landlords, that they weren't functioning as she had seen landlords functioning in the west of England. But particularly when she looked at what was happening on the ground in Kenmare in years of poverty, she found that the records of the convent indicated that the nuns were more generous in providing for the poor than landlords in the area, some of whom were absentees. So that in that sense, she's eroding entirely the credibility of what Hickson had been about. And this issue of genealogy, which had been the tool that Hickson had used for her history, that Cusack takes the example of the Petty family. William Petty, as you know, was the person in charge of the Cromwellian survey of Ireland. He was a great map maker whose energies and scientific expertise had made possible the Cromwellian confiscation of the country, and who in doing so identified a considerable amount of land which he would acquire himself, and a large amount of that land was in Kerry. But then she looks at the subsequent marriage of William Petty himself to I don't know, is it the daughter or the widow of Hardress Waller, who acquired a very extensive area of land in County Limerick, and Hardress Waller was a regicide, a person who had signed the death warrant of King Charles I. So then instead of all of this land having been declared confiscate by the Restoration, as should logically have happened, that instead of that, all of the land of the regicide was effectively absorbed by Petty into his lands as a consequence of this marriage. And then later, and here she's coming to the point where Hickson would have regarded as positive, the subsequent marriage between the heir of Anne Petty, who was the daughter of William Petty, and the Waller bride. Anne Petty then marries the heir to the Fitzmaurice property, thereby bringing together the property of one of the leading Anglo-Norman families in County Kerry, together with the Petty family, leading to the development of the Petty Fitzmaurice estate, which by the 19th century was the Lansdowne estate, and that the Petty Fitzmaurices had been Earls of Kerry, Earls of Shelburne, and eventually became Marquesses of Lansdowne, and were one of the largest property owners in the country. Now, Hickson would have represented all of this as positive, in that it was indicating that Protestant landowners in the country were not foreign, that the Fitzmaurices were one of the oldest Anglo-Norman families, and therefore gave them an entitlement. As far as Cusack was concerned, this marriage demonstrated the total unprincipled way in which Protestants went about grabbing land without any concern for principle, regicides, and then taking over the limited amount of land which was in Catholic hands was absorbed by them through strategic marriages of this kind. So in that sense, you see, there's a total polar position developed between these two women. One effectively was refuting the other. Now, why did Cusack become involved in this? Now, she says in the first instance, before she writes her illustrated history, she indicates that she was invited to become a historian, that she was approached. She doesn't say who approached her, but from what she writes and from her close associations with bishops, both Catholic bishops, both Irish and English, it's quite clear that Cusack was identified by virtue of the education she had acquired in England was an appropriate person for writing history. I think myself that the person who approached her was Patrick Moran, who was a nephew of Cardinal Cullen, because Moran had been particularly concerned to identify what a Catholic nationalist history should be about, and that wanted to have such history written in order to give Irish Catholics pride in themselves and to demonstrate the extent to which the divisions between the Anglo-Norman and the Gaelic populations had been eroded as a consequence of the common persecution of both by English Protestants. That as Moran had it, that the Irish were a nation of martyrs, that they had suffered more for their faith than any other people in the world. And it's that type of history which she is writing when she writes her illustrated history of Ireland. And she is now bringing that to the county level when she is writing the county of the Kingdom of Kerry, because she is taking local example to sustain the argument of bringing the grand national argument down onto the county level, in other words, diametrically opposed to what Hickson and her associates were about, in that they wanted to exclude the grand narrative and look at the local as giving demonstration of how Protestants were an integral part of society and had been improvers within that society itself. But as well as that, the other personal animus that develops between the two is associated with James Anthony Froude. Froude was one of the leading journalists in England of the mid part of the 19th century, an arch Tory who was totally opposed to Catholic emancipation and totally opposed to any bids of Irish independence from Britain in any shape or form, that Ireland was an integral part of a united kingdom, and he was a total advocate for unionism and wanted to give Protestants in Ireland a more backbone than they had in order to sustain their position. But Froude was a person sympathetic to Ireland and had visited Ireland on innumerable occasions throughout his life. So that in that sense, he's not an austere Tory in England writing critically of Ireland from a distance. He's a person who visits Ireland regularly throughout his life, and particularly visits County Kerry, where he appears to have been hosted by Hickson. So that one of his publications, which he publishes in Fraser's magazine, is A Fortnight Spent in Kerry. describing the beauties of the county in a way that the tourist industry would have approved of, and was saying that everything was wonderful in Kerry and in Ireland generally, were it not for the superstition and ignorance of the Catholic clergy, who are effectively drawing the population away from a recognition of the benefits of Victorian rule, and effectively making them a discontented element. And that the history of Ireland was effectively a demonstration how through the centuries, particularly starting in 1641, that the Irish had been led into rebellion as a consequence of the mal-influence of Catholic clergy, particularly of Jesuits. And we'll say that Hickson herself was also spoke very negatively of Jesuits. Indeed, she just says that the 1641 rebellion happened to start on St. Ignatius's Day, which is not true at all. But in any event, you can see that it was this particular article by Froude that provokes Cusack to effectively become the defender of Kerry. And as well as that, you can see that what Froude had written must have offended Catholic society in Kerry to a much greater degree, to a very considerable degree, because in one of the features of Cusack's history is a list of the Catholics of substance who had subsidized the work. So that in that sense, it was a work which had been subscribed. There was a collection of Catholics of substance within the county and Catholics outside the county, and a large number of bishops, Catholic bishops throughout the country at large, which had made possible this history, which was being written effectively to counter what Froude was about. And Froude, of course, it was recognized or known that he was writing a history of Ireland, which he published in 1872, the English in Ireland in the 18th century, which was vehemently anti-Catholic, but he would have seen it as strongly pro-Irish, in that he was arguing the case that the future of Ireland was that Ireland was going to prosper only when it was fully subservient to the Victorian government, and that was the way to enrichment and to improvement through the society at large. So I think we've explained now why do you have this outpouring of history in the 1870s. We can see why the polar position, or what appear to be polar positions of the two women historians, why they developed as they did, and how they developed as they did. But we also recognize that they're not as far apart as they themselves believed to be, and that each of them was an imperialist. Hickson quite clearly was an imperialist in a unionist sense. She didn't believe that there was such thing as an Irish nation as distinct from an English nation or a Scottish nation. She believed that all were common subjects of a British monarchy, and that they really stood to benefit by participation in an empire which was provided opportunity for all of them, and which was a growing global entity. But Cusack, on the other hand, also believed in the benefits of empire. And she believed that what she wanted Irish people to be proud of was proud of their achievements in the past, so that they could compete as equals with English and Scottish people within this empire, where they too were going to make a career for themselves. So then in that sense, while she was in favor of greater independence from landowners by their tenants, she doesn't appear to be at all sympathetic to greater degree of political independence of Ireland from the union government. So we can take questions now, and I think I'm within my 40 minutes. So.
I think the microphones are switched on, so if anyone would like to ask the second question, because nobody likes to ask the first one. So if anybody has a question. Yes, Fiona. Do you want to go to the...
Thank you very, very much. That was a great talk. My question is, I just wonder, how was Cusack? How was she rated as a historian, do you know, at the time? Like, what was her place kind of in the canon of the time?
No, I mean, I would say that Cusack as a historian is, if you're to compare Cusack and Hickson, Hickson is an extremely good documentary historian. Hickson continuously through her life pursues documentary evidence and supports what she says with documentary evidence. That's why her two-volume collection, her arguments are sustained by documents. Cusack, on the other hand, is an arguments woman. She puts forward the argument, but she doesn't have much documentary evidence to support it. And to see that Hickson would have gone through this documentary training and compilation that Rowan would have been engaged upon. Whereas Cusack, on the other hand, would have obtained what by the standards of women of her generation would have been she would have been a much broader range of education and literature, and she was quite fluent. She wrote incredibly through her life, and I haven't followed her life to the end because it becomes more complex at the end because she, as you know, she converts to Protestantism again at the end of her life and becomes bitterly anti-Catholic. But I didn't want to introduce that complicating factor. But I wouldn't think she's any documentary training as a historian in the way that Hickson would have had.
I'm fascinated by you. I'm fascinated by the title. I think to call it the Kingdom of Kerry in that context,
Yes, yeah.
in itself, said a lot about the writer.
I find that talk absolutely fascinating. But do you think that both Hickson and Froude had serious hang-ups about the Catholic Church? Because Hickson, I believe, converted to Catholicism and then fell out with the Catholic Church and went back to being a Protestant. Yeah. And in Froude's case, I'm fairly sure I'm right in saying that his older brother, who was reputed to be far brighter than him, became a Catholic along with the Oxford movement and Newman, and died young. And maybe there was a sort of jealousy factor there as well.
Yeah. I've seen the suggestion that Hickson had converted at some point, but I wouldn't place any credence in that. But Hickson's attitude towards Catholicism does appear to have hardened over time. Both the circumstances that once the row between herself and Cusack develops, it makes her more bitter. And she does feel that Cusack cheated her, so she's certainly bitter about that. So, and then I think the association with Froude. Froude comes from a clerical background, a very evangelist Protestant. When he first moves to Ireland, he's living with a very evangelical Protestant family in County Wicklow, who believes that they are surrounded by papists who have knives sharpened, who want to cut their throats, the same way as happened to their counterparts in 1641. So that in that sense, and I don't think Froude's attitude towards Catholicism and Jesuits changed much over time, that Catholicism was the source of all evil, so to speak.
Thank you. I think that was fantastic. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
For Neil Margaret, that was fascinating. I had just said something, someone said that they couldn't hear it. I just said that following from Fiona's point, the title, the Kingdom of Kerry, I think is particularly interesting. We're now going to move towards a lunch. And I'm going to maybe introduce the fact that, are we here, Marish, or are we outside? Mary, do you want to maybe have one of the mics or?
Yes, thank you, June. Yes, there's a lovely dining room just there on the left, so you can dine there if you wish. It's probably the better space because it's large and you can remain socially distanced again. Or if you wish, you can go into the bar, but there's very limited spacing there. But the dining room here in the hotel is just through here, and you've ample time. If you do wish to go uptown, of course, you've ample time to return at this point. So enjoy lunch, and thank everyone for this morning.
Welcome back, everyone, to the afternoon session of the first day of the Daniel O'Connell School 2021. Delighted you're here and delighted that so many are viewing online. This afternoon session is devoted to looking at the issue of towards an Irish state, and we'll be taking a particularly Kerry perspective on the emergence of the Irish state. And we have three distinguished historians who are going to talk to us this afternoon from their own research and expertise. Our first speaker is Dr. Thomas Earls Fitzgerald, who is a historian of modern Ireland, and he's held postdoctoral fellowships from Trinity College and Concordia University, Montreal. Earlier this year, he published Competence and Civilians in Revolutionary Ireland, 1918-1923, as well as a short history of the Labour Party. He's also published with our other two speakers, Mary McAuliffe and Owen O'Shea, in Kerry, 1916, Historic Legacies of the East and Legacies of the Easter Rising. So the theme of his topic this afternoon is Insurgency and Reprisals in Kerry and Ireland, 1920 to 1921. Thomas Earls, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Ruth. Just to begin, I think sometimes in life we work under assumptions, and sadly those assumptions prove to be incorrect. In this case, I felt I could get quite a lot into 25 minutes of talking, but I'm frankly not sure if I can, but I'll do my best anyway. And I apologize if it appears a bit rushed. Firstly, I would just like to extend my thanks to Mary and Morris and everyone here at the Daniel O'Connell Summer School for having me down. It is a real pleasure to be in this wonderful corner of Ireland. And secondly, it's a real great pleasure to be on the same panel with my friends and colleagues, Mary McAuliffe and Owen O'Shea. Like Ruth mentioned there, earlier this year, I published quite a heavy, expensive academic book, and it's quite difficult to get sufficient publicity for that type of publication, but Mary and Owen have kindly promoted the book on social media, and I must say that means an awful lot to me. To begin, over the next 25 minutes, what I'd really like to focus on is the concept of irony, and irony in relation to Daniel O'Connell, and irony in relation to the Ireland that emerged and what Ireland experienced in the years 1920 to 1921. And I think, considering this is the Daniel O'Connell Summer School, I think there is a great sad irony about O'Connell, who for me is, without question, the most significant and influential and important political figure Ireland has ever produced. And he strikes me as an incredibly modern man. In modern parlance, we might even call him very progressive in relation not just to the Catholic people of Ireland, but also as an abolitionist, as a champion of the rights of Jewish people, and of the rights of smaller Protestant churches, together with being an early abolitionist. Yet nonetheless, since the 1916 Rising and the success of that physical force tradition, and how that physical force tradition has very much defined modern Ireland, people like O'Connell sit in a sort of awkward place that people don't really understand his work, and often I feel people are too quick to criticize it. De Valera himself in later life would say that his generation did not fully appreciate or understand the work of O'Connell. And with that in mind, with that irony in mind, we might begin by looking at where he was from in Cahirsiveen and one tragic instance that occurred there on the 16th of March 1920. In the spring of 1920, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the policing force in Ireland, had been withdrawing from their smaller isolated barracks and regrouping in the larger towns and cities across Ireland. The barracks at Cahirsiveen had been evacuated, and the bicycles that the RIC owned, or I don't know, I suppose they owned them, were given to the local caretaker of the local courthouse, a man called Cornelius Kelly, who was 42 in 1920. For whatever reasons, Mr. Kelly took the bicycles that belonged to the RIC in Cahirsiveen into his custody when they left. And on the night of the 16th of March, 1920, Cornelius Kelly was very cruelly murdered in front of his wife and children by the IRA, who then, for reasons of their own, took the bicycles. And I think there is a strange irony there. And again, something that I'm very acutely aware of is that I'm talking about death and killing and destruction in this part of the country, and I hope I can do it in a sensitive and good fashion. But nonetheless, the killing of Kelly is ironic, not simply because of the very innocent nature of his work, that he simply just was looking after some bicycles, but perhaps there's an irony that perhaps there's something left unsaid. Perhaps he was an unpopular character. Perhaps it was a local feud or a vendetta, who knows? But it really strikes me because of how quiet this part of the country was in 1920. The Royal Irish Constabulary, in fact, noted that the Ivra Peninsula was easily the most quiet and peaceful parts of Ireland in the spring of 1920. But what had been happening in 1920, which is unique, is that because of the RIC evacuating and leaving much of rural Ireland unpoliced, a new and largely peaceful revolution was occurring, which was affecting people's lives in a very tangible way. And that is the rise of the Sinn Féin movement in local Ireland. But I might say with the assistance of the Labour Party and the trade union movement, who are often too sadly written out of the history of Irish life. And the Sinn Féin movement in 1920, in terms of local government, in terms of control of the courts, in terms of land reform, etc., can easily and quite tangibly say that they are the governing force of Ireland and that they have far more of a say in Irish people's lives than the retreating British administration. All of this, I might say, is being done in a largely peaceful manner. And while the IRA does exist, and particularly after January 1920, there is an increase in attacks, etc., an increase in violence. It is of a very small level. And the second irony is that that peaceful revolution was effectively smashed by the forces of the British state. In reaction to this largely peaceful revolution, I would argue, there is an ironic over-response by the forces of the British state with the deployment of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries to Ireland in the summer and the autumn of 1920. And here we might return to Cahirsiveen, where the Cahirsiveen columnist for the Kerryman newspaper in the autumn of 1920 reflected that it is becoming an almost daily or weekly occurrence that the Black and Tans come into Cahirsiveen, they loot shops, they beat people up, they smash windows, and they generally cause a ruckus. And the columnist for Kerryman for this part of the county noted that he didn't understand why this was happening because they weren't being provoked. There was no IRA action that was provoking them. Similarly speaking, this is not just in Cahirsiveen, but across the county, in Dingle, in Tralee, in Castle Island, in Listowel, in Rathmore, a similar picture of unprovoked hostility and violence and aggression from the forces of the British state is being consistently meted out, or Irish people are increasingly having to endure this unprovoked aggression. In Tralee, it was noted that it was becoming an almost daily occurrence in the summer and autumn of 1920 that people were being beaten up and assaulted by the Black and Tans and auxiliaries. And here we come to a stranger irony, that rather than these people had obviously come to restore law and order as they saw it, but in fact they clearly, from their own perspective, things only get worse, because what that causes to do is in fact only galvanize the IRA to greater levels of action, because now that the forces of the British state begin killing people and lethal violence becomes common, the IRA in turn feel that they have to up their game and that they have to also use lethal violence. But there's a strange irony here as well, because I would argue that since the publication of Dan Breen's My Fight for Irish Freedom in 1924, a very specific narrative in relation to Irish Republican violence has developed, which in many respects defines the Irish Revolution, or how people have chosen to look at it, in terms of a few intrepid band of fighters. They push the pace, and violence escalates, and everything gets more intense and more bloody and more violent. But the IRA, Irish Republicans, are pushing the narrative, and this narrative eventually leads to truce and eventually treaty. But I think that is a very interesting narrative. It's been most eloquently exemplified by Ernie O'Malley on Another Man's Wound, and of course Tom Barry's 1949 masterpiece, Guerrilla Days in Ireland. And I don't know how many of you read it, but it is very stirring stuff, to the extent that I'm sure if Jeffrey Donaldson or Jim Allister read it, I'm sure they too couldn't help but be slightly moved. But with that in mind, that narrative effectively gives the Republican or the Irish nationalist control or autonomy of the narrative in which they are pushing the pace, in which I would in fact argue that it is the British state, and it is the British state that are causing the reaction and provoking the violence and provoking the escalations and such. And I would just like to focus on British violence in Ireland, and specifically here in Cahirsiveen again, in terms of how it has been characterised. In the extensive literature that exists on British violence in Ireland, the emphasis is on essentially situational factors. That these men, veterans of the Great War, of Gallipoli, the Somme, etc., find themselves in Ireland in their own back door, and they're fighting an enemy who doesn't wear a uniform. They're fighting an enemy that they can't see. They don't know who is a civilian, who is an opponent. They are existing in a stressful atmosphere where no one will talk to them. These men find that they are drinking too much, and then they lose a comrade, and they take it out of anger and frustration. And I find that narrative very frustrating, and in fact, I would even argue potentially misleading, because it downgrades these men essentially to boozed up thugs without any complicating political motivation or ideology. Whereas in fact, if you look at the nature of their violence at this time, it has a very clear and obvious political dimension, in that they will go after and attack absolutely anything that they feel is associated with Irish republicanism, Irish nationalism, Irish separatism, or anything that has an Irish separatist identity or culture to it. So for instance, here in the town of Cahirsiveen, people with Irish language shop signs are made to tear them down and stamp on them. People are made to take the tricolour out of their shops and burn it and replace it with the Union Jack. People are beaten up and then made sing God Save the King, or stamp on photos of De Valera, or burn images of the 1916 proclamation. And I would argue this has a very strong political dimension to it, a political dimension that we should understand is at the heart of this strange new stirring conservative force that is occurring across Europe. After World War I, there was the potential of a brave, new and very different world, a socialist or indeed communist world in which the hierarchies and the structures of 19th century life would be torn apart by something far more egalitarian. And the response to that by the status quo, the powers that be, in many respects the powers that be, whether the Ottoman Empire, the Romanov Empire, the Hohenzollern, I can never pronounce that, Hohenzollern Germany, or indeed the centuries-old Austro-Hungarian Empire, had been crushing in destruction. And in being replaced by this threat of this new communist world. And what you see is this intense overreaction on the part of military elements of those old orders in an attempt to destroy this threat to the status quo. The status quo had already been changed, but there is this intensely violent response to maintain what was left of that status quo. So, for instance, in countries like Italy, the Italian squadristi, fascist squadristi, I should say, attack and destroy and physically tear apart anything that they feel is reminiscent or somehow associated with socialism. Hungarian conservatives do something as well too, as do the German Freikorps in the urban centers of Germany, attacking and destroying anything they see as somehow left-wing. And like I say, all of these forces tend to be veterans of the Great War. And like we say, we must return and remember that the Black and Tans and auxiliaries who came to Ireland were also predominantly veterans of that Great War. And they returned to a Britain in which they were unsure of their sacrifice. They identified strongly with king and country and with what they had gone through in the Great War. And then they found themselves in Ireland facing a rebellion or a insurgency, or facing a society which didn't recognize or appreciate that sacrifice or the crown or king or country. And they feel that it's their duty to attack and to destroy what they see as a something that is threatening their way of life and threatening their society, a society they felt that they had defended, and that they felt they were justified in using extreme violence, to the extent that during the summer of 1921, the British Army drew up plans which involved actually locking up the entire nationalist population of Ireland in Boer War-style concentration camps. I think we can't see that as anything else other than highly political. But again, perhaps we might return to O'Connell here, in that for all his life, O'Connell fought for the dignity of Irish people and for Irish people to have a sense of pride and to withstand and work against the onslaught of derision and aggression that Irish people faced from their nearest neighbour. I think it is a sad irony that not that long after his death, the Irish nation or the Irish people were still facing similar threats, and that the work of Daniel O'Connell was very much alive in the Ireland of 1920 and 1921. And now I'll just get on to my final point. And that's the last irony, I suppose, so to speak. Some people have rightly noted that perhaps my book could have had more of a dealt with the Civil War more fully, and that's a criticism I fully accept. But what I do try and do is be equal-handed in terms of looking at the nature of British violence, but at looking at the nature of Irish separatist violence as well. And perhaps we might think about the Ireland that emerged from that separatist tradition and how people look at it today. I've always been very struck by the Sean O'Whalan in The Rocky Road to Dublin, where, looking back at his life, he laments that the revolution between 1916 and 1921 was this incredible chance for a new, free Ireland, for something better, a republican and egalitarian Ireland. But of course, sadly, that was betrayed, firstly in 1921 by the treaty and the conservatism of the Cosgrave government. And then for O'Whalan, he thinks that Fianna Fáil, as they emerge in the late 1920s, are a potentially revolutionary or socially egalitarian force that can really reignite that passion of revolution and such. But O'Whalan, of course, says that 32, when Fianna Fáil came into power, became just the same as 22. And in later life, O'Whalan laments the Ireland that could have been, the Ireland that could have come from revolution. And I think that is a very easy and quite intoxicating and very simple narrative for people to comfort themselves in, that we can look at the Irish Revolution as some moment in which things could have been different, or we can see it as this potentially egalitarian moment in our history, or the great intoxicating idea of what could have been the Irish Revolution if only it hadn't been betrayed, first by Cosgrave and then by De Valera and such. However, I would argue that the conservative and homogeneous nature of the conservative Ireland that emerged from revolution is in fact highly evident in the revolution that was occurring. For instance, I talked about the policing of Ireland, or the fact that when the RIC aren't in power, you have this schism or void where the Irish volunteers become a sort of police force, and Sinn Féin are very much in control of much of rural Ireland. Well, all they in fact do is reintroduce and confirm and strengthen the existing ties and the existing conservative social structures, whether in relation to land or in relation to policing. And I'll just give another two examples. Perhaps we can see the shameful treatment of women in independent Ireland echoed in revolutionary Ireland, in that, as my friend and colleague Mary McAuliffe and Linda Connolly have pointed out in recent years, that a phenomenon that occurred during revolutionary Ireland was young women who had associations with either British soldiers or British police were taken from their homes by IRA and sometimes Come on the Mon members and had their hair forcibly cut off them. Sadly, this occurrence was most frequent here in County Kerry, and it actually happened in this town of Cahirsiveen, which is sad to say, of course. But I think we can read much into that image in terms of a woman who has to go out into the world and see other Irish people, and she doesn't have any hair. She is clearly being exposed to shame and ridicule, and in many respects, essentially being denied entry to the Irish nation, or being exposed as someone who is a fallen woman and who has essentially betrayed the Irish nation. And again, I think we might think that, or I would argue that perhaps we can see echoes of that, like I say, in the shameful treatment and how often women were excluded from the Irish nation in independent Ireland. And a final point I might ask, or I might suggest, is that when I talked about earlier Cahirsiveen and County Kerry being quiet, that was very much the case in terms of lethal violence, in terms of limited numbers of shootings, ambushes, the things that we associate with the War of Independence. But what was happening was that the IRA were engaged in something that is talked about a lot less, and that was consistent and relentless intimidation of civilians, in terms of consistently being warned publicly and privately that if you have any association with the British Crown or British police, we are going to attack you, we might kill you, we're certainly going to beat you up, we'll take your food, things like that. And in fact, what I highlight in my book is that this type of intimidation of people, whether it was assaults, whether it was written warnings, whether it was public warnings, was twice as likely to occur than the intra-combatant shootings and ambushes that the period is remembered for. So in many respects, a civilian's experience of the War of Independence was, on the one level, intimidation by the Crown forces, but also perhaps intimidation by the IRA or Republican forces as well. And you could argue that there is some type of military logic to this, of course, that perhaps the only way for an insurgency to work is that you isolate the civilian community from the incumbent or the controlling forces and such. And there is some military logic in making sure that the civilian community don't interact or don't cooperate with their opponents. Nonetheless, I think there is also something deeper going on here as well, in that, again, this is an imposition by Republican forces saying that we have created a new homogenous society in which there is only one way to be Irish, and we are instructing you how to live, and we are instructing you on what type of politics you should have. And I think, again, if we return to O'Connell, we might think about this for a moment, because it has often been suggested that Ireland is a deeply homogenous country. Our society and our culture is remarkably kind of samey or one. It's kind of defined by certain key characteristics, to the extent that it's often been suggested that it is, almost quite difficult to stand out or to be different or to say something different in Ireland today. I think in many cases that continues to be the case in some respects, in that, a lot of, it's difficult to really engage in very fierce critical thinking because a lot of people kind of tend to have the same opinions on things. And it could be argued that Daniel O'Connell was the founder of that, in that, as the founder of modern Irish nationalism, what he did was that he took the grievances and specifically Catholic identity of nationalism, and he pushed Irish nationalist grievances as being largely exemplified by Catholicism or the Irish Catholic experience, and that perhaps created greater divisions, and perhaps indeed that identity as Irish nationalism being bound up in a sort of Catholic identity very much informed the conservative and perhaps homogeneous nature of the independent state and the deeply conservative nature of the independent state that came out of revolution. But I would just conclude by thinking that, as O'Connell was such a modern and unique and free-thinking man, that I very much think that he certainly would have been very dissatisfied with the conservative Ireland that emerged after the Irish Revolution. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thomas Earls, thank you very much indeed for provoking us to think a little more deeply about events in our at the foundation of the state, both nationally and in Kerry and in the European context. So thank you. Now, have we any questions or comments to Thomas Earls on his paper? I'm sure you has provoked a few thoughts. Yes, please, now.
Not wait until the end.
Just looking to tie in the points that you are making. On the one hand, you were saying that that the violence in Ireland was led, or very much instigated and escalated by the British troops, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, and that they were not really reacting against any violence within the society. At the same time, towards the end of your speech, you said that there was a huge amount of oppression of the peoples by the Republican movement. So in fact, what the British auxiliaries and Black and Tans were doing was really reacting quite appropriately, in a sense, to a very strong national movement. It's not fair to say that they were not reacting against anything at all. They were reacting against a very strong, cohesive movement in the only way that they knew how. I'm not justifying them, I'm just trying to tie in the 2 points that you were making.
Yes, that's very eloquently put. And I just make 2 points there, is that in the newspapers and in the police reports at the time, and in terms of how people are looking at it, the Black and Tans are far more concerned with some vision of the IRA, some vision of a gunman and such. And in terms of the actual intimidation that's going on, they don't really know how to actually deal with it, so to speak. And that I would even argue that they're unaware of the scale and the extent of the intimidation. But the point I'm trying to make as well is that, like you say, Sinn Féin and the Labour Party do produce this incredibly cohesive and powerful movement. And it is in response to that, it's in response to this, what I would argue is a largely peaceful revolution, that they bring in this, change it into a violent revolution, if that makes sense.
Any other comments or questions to Thomas Arrows? Yes, please, Nessa.
Just on the incident in Cahirsiveen, Thomas, the Cornelius Kelly man, I just think maybe it might be worth looking at where the RIC might have gotten those bicycles. Because in 1921, my father was a first-year secondary school student in St. Brendan's College in Killarney. And I can remember him telling me that he was cycling home from Killarney with a group of fellow 12, 13-year-olds to Fossa, and they were intercepted by a Black and Tan lorry, and they took all their bicycles. Every one of them, they took the bicycles from them, loaded them up into the back of the lorry. So that just might, a bicycle was an important thing, it just might be, part of the animosity towards the man who then took all the RIC bicycles. That's just a thought.
No, and I first read about Cornelius Kelly in T. Ryle Dwyer's book, Tan, Terror and Troubles, in Kerry's Real Fighting Story, and I've always just been very struck by it. And like I say, on one level, because there's so little violence in Cahirsiveen, but I think that particular case leaves so many unanswered questions in relation to, I often think it could well have been just a horrible accident, in that, perhaps no one meant to fire a gun that night. Or perhaps, like you say, perhaps he was a deeply unpopular man. Perhaps he, might have been working as an agent for the British or something like that. So it's one of these cases that it's kind of very hard to fully understand what happened, unless, like yourself, you have that really kind of more in-depth local knowledge and such. Thank you. My pleasure.
So time for one more question or comment, if anybody would like to take the microphone. No? Okay, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Thomas Arrows, for a fascinating presentation. So our next speaker is Professor Mary McAuliffe, whose latest publication, she's also a historian, latest publication is a biography of Margaret Skinner, fascinating suffragette and the only woman to be injured fighting in 1916. She has also published We Were There, 77 Women of the Easter Rising, co-written with Liz Gillis, and Kerry 1916, Histories and Legacies of the Easter Rising, which I mentioned earlier, and which she was a co-editor. Mary is going to speak on the history of Common Naman in Kerry and the part which women played in the establishment of Irish independence. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to Maurice and all the committee for inviting me to talk here this year at the Summer Autumn Daniel O'Connell Summer School. And I suppose, like Thomas, I just want to maybe make a connection back towards O'Connell, not himself, but his aunt or great aunt who wrote Cuina Arta Lira Mara Gwivni Connell, and the voices of women. And I was really struck by that when reading Durin Negrifa's Ghost in the Throat, about how the voices and experiences of women get forgotten, get overlooked, get marginalized in many of our histories. And I suppose over the years, it's been part of my vocation, I suppose, as a historian, is to research and write and analyze the experiences of women in this last decade, in the revolutionary period. And the decade of centenaries has been excellent about that. It began, I remember, for writing an article, I looked at the first document produced by the government-appointed committee on the decade of centenaries, and they planned from 2012 to 2022 then. 23 has been added subsequently, or 1923. And the first mention of women was going to be in 2018. The first commemoration of women was going to be in 2018, of course, with the election of Countess Markievicz as the first MP and then subsequently the first TD. But because of voices raised, my own included, we began to look more at the women, and certainly in 2014, the commemoration of the foundation of Cumann na mBan has started a process by which many more historians and researchers are looking at what the women did. And it reminds me of what Gemma Clarke said, that we have to look at the women's interactions. She's talking about the Civil War, but I think it relates to the War of Independence as well, of how useful a gender framework is for understanding these violent and transformative years in Irish history. And I think for women's history, and particularly as the theme is towards a new state, because of course the women experience a different new state than the men do. It's very much a gendered new state. And I think and Thomas alluded it to in his speech as well, I think in the War of Independence and Civil War, and I am going to talk a little bit about the Civil War, we see what will be the position of women in the new state. And that is very evident in how they are treated. So I look at the violence against women. And particularly in the War of Independence, active service units, for example, can go on the run, but the militant women, and I'm looking today at the violence against militant women. Thomas spoke about the women who were attacked for company keeping, and quite a few here in Cahirsiveen. I think it was more than one. There were 2 or 3 attacks. And over the last 2 years, I've been doing a lot of research, and I now have about 240 separate incidences of violent attacks or forcible haircutting of women between 1919 was the first one, November 1919, and late 1922. There's not much of it done in the Civil War. The majority of it in Munster, in Kerry, in Cork. But there is no county in Ireland where it doesn't happen. And I think actually the experience of it is horrific, but what is equally horrific is the knowledge that it could happen, because all of this is being reported in the newspapers, the local and national newspapers. So women knew what could happen if they were accused of company keeping. But militant women were also attacked. The Cumann na mBan women, some of them forcibly haircut, some of them physically beaten up, many of them burnt out. And I want to look at those experiences, because the home front becomes not a safe space, but a battlefront, a space of gendered, and I would argue sexualized violation and terror. This violation of the intimate, feminine, domestic space reflects, as Louise Ryan has written, the intensely political work which was going on inside many Irish homes. And again, it's going back to the fact that we often talk about the War of Independence through ambushes and executions and military actions. But what was happening inside of homes all around the country? It was intensely political work going on there, and indeed military work. Many of these homes had an arms dump probably 2 fields away that the women were in charge of. They were also the hospitals, the medical centres, the feeding units of active service units. So they were actually participating in that very military sense in the War of Independence. The traditional spheres then of male and female, or masculine and feminine, had collapsed, and war is now everywhere. It was a war that, as Justin Stover has written, was intimate, where the British security forces and the IRA routinely violated private spaces. And as Stover suggests, the acknowledgement of women who'd borne the brunt of the raids and interrogations suggests that some of the most vital contributions to the independence movement took place away from the ambush site. And again, that's emphasizing that the ambush is very important, and who did what in ambushes, and the success or failure of those ambushes and who was killed. But we also have to look at the home front, because the home front is not that delineated space of safety, but it is also part of the war. It is often acknowledged by IRA men and women that women had it hard in their homes. Even in their ordinary domestic, familial and communal duties, such as shopping, going to the school, going to mass, there was a threat of constant violence. In evidence given by RIC member John McNamara to the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland, he described an attack by the Crown forces on women and children coming from evening mass in Ballylongford in North Kerry. He said 2 black and tans from the barracks went to the church in the village at about 7 o'clock in the evening, where 200 or 300 residents had gathered for evening devotion. They stationed themselves at the gate of the church with batons and beat people as they came through the gate. There were many men and women and children beaten up that night. The 2 black and tans who perpetuated this outrage boasted about it in the barracks, but there was no official investigation. And as Ernie O'Malley wrote, the black and tan reprisals on family homes and on women, for him, there was a silence for a time as we watched, helpless, feeling cowardly and miserable. Because it was the militant women who were receiving the brunt of the reprisals from late 1920 onwards, in large part because of a realization by the Crown forces, the RIC, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, of the women's effectiveness as an integral part, as I've described, of the guerrilla war effort. As Lil Conlon wrote in her Cumann memoir, 1969, it was late 1920 and into 1921 when the British authorities began to recognise the importance of the Cumann women. She said attention was focused on the women very much at this time because they were in receipt of information from their intelligence division owing to raids and captures of documents that the women were playing a major part. The going was tough on the female sex. They were unable to go on the run and so were constantly subjected to having their homes raided and precious possessions destroyed. To intensify reigns of terror, swoops were made at night, entries forced into their home, women's hair cut off in brutal fashion, as well as suffering other indignities and insults. And I think that phrase, other indignities and insults, gives us a hint that there's also some other types of violence going on here. I am not addressing them in this paper, but it is part of my research at the moment to look at the sexual violence that was occurring during this period, and indeed to reflect on what Thomas said about the Republican police. Some historians have said we don't have a lot of evidence of sexual violence in the War of Independence because there was no reporting to the RIC. But actually what I'm finding, not a huge amount, but what I am finding is some of these attacks were reported to the Republican police, both of black and tans attacking, but also IRA men attacking women in their homes and how they're dealing with that. So the absence of evidence doesn't mean there wasn't sexual violence. It's beginning to show itself in different ways through different archival sources at this stage. I want to look, however, at specifically the violence visited on women. The interim report from the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland details the violence women experienced during raids. Women had the privacy of their homes, their bedrooms invaded in the dead of the night. Such was the terror, the report says. In some places, those who were not on the run and the infirm and the aged and women and children would appear to feel safer in the fields than in their homes. And I want to look at two case studies. Sorry. And they happen within a month of each other in 1920. And these just give you an idea of what is going on. There's an exhibition in Galway Museum at the moment where they have a subsection which looks at violence against women. And in a night in September in Galway, 5 women had their hair cut off. One by the IRA, Eileen Baker, for giving evidence at a court of inquiry over the execution of Constable Crum in Galway train station a couple of weeks earlier. And then 4 women who were either suspected of being or were in Cumann, but certainly suspected of having Republican sympathies, were attacked by the Crown Forces and had their hair cropped. So you can see that tit for tat happening. And interestingly, the image you see there in the little, that's a bottle cap, is a photograph taken of Maggie Broderick, who was one of the women hair cropped by the Crown Forces after she had her hair cut off. So you can see that it was an extreme attack, and particularly at that time, women's hair were their crowning glory. So to have their hair cut off. But interestingly, the women who were attacked for keeping company were ashamed of what happened. Oftentimes, the Cumann women saw this as a mark of pride, indeed, a mark of their contribution to the war effort. This was their wound that they were experiencing, unlike, being wounded in a battle. Here was evidence of the attacks on them by the IRA. And the other attack happened a month later in October 1920 in Lixnaw in North Kerry, and where Michael Kelly, in his statement to the American Commission, discussed the attacks in Listowel and Lixnaw by Black and Tans. A young woman in Listowel, whose brother was about to join the RIC, had been attacked by the IRA. The brother was beaten up and the sister had her hair cropped off. And again, you see the gendered punishment. The brother who was about to join the RIC did not have his hair cropped, but his sister did. And then in retaliation for that, but also because of ongoing problems with the Republicans in Lixnaw, 4 young women in Lixnaw were attacked late at night by the Black and Tans. McElligott, the two McElligott sisters, Miss Lovett and Stephen Grady. This is Bridget Grady, and she's marrying the brother of the McElligotts there, but she got her hair cropped off. They came looking for her brother Stephen, an IRA man. They found Bridget at home, grabbed her, took her outside the house and cut off her hair. All of these women were either associated with Republican men or in Cumann themselves and were known to have Republican sympathies. So again, you can see that the women were experiencing that very visceral terror and violence. Even if they weren't being attacked themselves, the knowledge that they could be attacked at any time was always there. These raids, as the Irish Bulletin noted, were a source of sleeplessness, nervous breakdowns, and in the case of expectant mothers, produced grave results for mother and child. However, the incidences as reported by the women of Cumann came as no shock to them. They were working for a cause, and the dangers of that work included coming to the attention of the Crown Forces. In most of the cases, the women stoically continue their work for Ireland and for the Republican cause until the truce, and then many continued as anti-treaty militants into the Civil War. And this is what I want to look at. Many of these Republican women had given their all to the Republican cause. And we know that Cumann, for the most part, reject the treaty, particularly outside of Cork, where you do have some Cumann pro-treaty branches. And we were always trying to unpack why Cumann women were so vehemently anti-treaty. And I would argue that part of it is the actual trauma and suffering that they had gone through for a 32-county republic that had been proclaimed in the 1916 proclamation. That was their touchstone. That was what they were fighting for. And because this is not what was being delivered in the treaty, they reject the treaty. So the second question I want to unpack is relation to the activities and experiences of Republican anti-treaty women in the period 1922 and 1923. These anti-treaty women were for the most part, or had already spent the majority of the time active during the War of Independence. Members describe in their pension applications, memoirs and personal reminiscences the activities we've come to expect of Cumann na mBan. They ran safe houses, they protected arms dumps, they did scouting and intelligence work. However, as Tom Doyle in his book Civil War in Kerry has pointed out, given the central role being in possession of arms and ammunition played in public order legislation, Kerry Command saw female activists as a loophole that needed to be closed off to secure more prosecutions. Paddy O'Daly, the head of the Dublin Brigade, and his officers in Kerry during the Civil War fully understood the vital role women could play. They themselves had experienced the central vital role that women could play when they were operating in Dublin during the War of Independence. So to facilitate preventing the anti-treaty IRA women, or the anti-treaty Cumann na mBan women helping the Civil War effort in Kerry, in late November 1922, a room was set aside in the county jail at Moiderwell to accommodate female Republican prisoners. Many of the anti-treaty Republican women were involved in the transportation of arms and ammunition during the period, and while 20 Kerry Republican female activists were imprisoned in Dublin, in Kilmainham and Mountjoy Jail, many others were arrested, imprisoned for periods of days or hours or weeks, and mistreated in their role as anti-treaty militants. O'Daly had came face to face with the militancy of women in an attack on a home of Michael Fleming in Kilcummon, near Killarney, believing it to be the Republicans' East Kerry headquarters in August 1922. At the house, they called on the occupants to surrender, as reported by newspapers. And Brigadier O'Daly himself, with some officers, led into the house and called on all the occupants to line up. Those present were still in bed, and a lady, Miss Fleming, I believe, the newspaper report said, shouted down the stairs, "Wait until I dress." And what she was doing was delaying them because, of course, there was a bomb set. When the bomb exploded, one of the splinters hit O'Daly on the thigh and wounded others in the party. Making a search of the place, they found rifles, revolvers, bombs, and equipment. "We left about 4 o'clock in the morning," they said. "Miss Fleming, despite the throwing of the bomb, remained to look after the place." Miss Fleming was lucky on this occasion. Other Republican women avoided imprisonment by going on the run for weeks or months at the time. On the 27th of November 1922, the Freeman's Journal reported that national troops arrested the following: Miss M. Bryan, High Street, Killarney; Miss N. Hurley, same; Miss O'Connor, New Street, Killarney; and Miss O'Leary, Kilgarvan. All were taken to Motherwell Jail. On Public na hÉireann, the war edition of 4th November 1922, noted that 3 girls in Abbeydorney were arrested by Free State troops. Failing to get men, they are now filling Kerry jails with women. While this can be taken to some degree as anti-treaty hyperbole and propaganda, there is no doubt that O'Daly and the troops under his command in Kerry recognised the threat posed by the anti-treaty women, and they were treated as a clear and present danger. Similarly, as the Crown Forces had realised by late 1920 that the women were actually vital. Other attacks on anti-treaty women included an extraordinary night in Killarney in September 1922, when armed men raided certain houses, dragged 6 girls from their beds who sympathised with the irregulars, and painted their bodies with green paint. The implication being, of course, they stripped them. And I've seen some reports that actually say they did strip them. As reported in the Irish Independent, Brigadier O'Daly, who oversees the national forces in the town, is investigating the matter and promises to mete out extreme measures to the culprit. The outrage is universally condemned. Nothing more, however, it seems, was heard of the incident. In late October 1922, newspaper reported a new departure when 10 very active Cumann na mBan girls were arrested in their homes in Tralee. Others evaded arrest. Those taken into custody were lodged in Tralee Female Prison. Additionally, it was reported during a big roundup between Abbeydorney and Kilflynn, 35 prisoners were taken, including 3 Cumann na mBan girls known to be active irregular agents. Later in November in Castle Gregory, newspapers reported that some very active irregulars were captured, including 2 girls who were found in possession of bombs. And actually, the newspapers throughout the Civil War were very exercised by gun girls and girls being found with bombs. They actually, the idea that women had become extremely militant now, that they were actually handling arms and ammunition and shooting and setting bombs, I would argue, is the beginning of the idea that these women were furies, they were Amazons, they were unmanageable, ungovernable revolutionaries, as both Cosgrave and De Valera would regard them. Militant women were to be feared. The violence escalated into 1922 and early 23. 1923 in January, the Cork Examiner reported that Ethel and Sheila Hartnett, Relina Ryan, Hannah Lyons, a national teacher, Hannah O'Carroll, Nora Healy, and Miss Randall, active ladies in irregular movement in Kinmare, were arrested, brought to Tralee and lodged in the county jail. By March of that year, 23, a notice from the Kerry Command of the National Army recorded 3 categories of people in the county. 1, loyal and open support. 2, sorry, you have it there. 2, diffidence and apathy born of fear of the irregulars and a desire for peace. And 3, open hostility. Open hostility is noted, is mostly displayed by the female. March and April 1923 were also the terror months in Kerry. We all know the story of that. Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge, Cahirsiveen and Clashmelkin caves in North Kerry, where many men were killed and executed, basically. These incidents were to have a traumatic and long-lasting impact on Kerry and on anti-treaty women, even if by the summer there was little fight left in the demoralised Republican ranks. It was the women who were, to the detriment of their physical, mental and emotional well-being, often left to pick up the pieces. I'll just give you one example, the pension application of Molly O'Shea of the Kilflynn Company of the Cumann, which reflects this. A member from 1919, during 1922 and 23, she had charge of the irregular camp in the Ballymah Woods, from which an irregular active service unit operated. And she was always in grave danger doing this work and many times under fire. Her brother George O'Shea was captain of the Kilflynn IRA and was one of the men killed at Ballyseedy, as well as 2 others whom she knew, Tim Toomey and Aero Lyons, killed at Ballyseedy and Clashmelkin, respectively. One reference letter on her pension file states that her suffering about this time was very great. Subsequent events at Clashmelkin and Ballyseedy unnerved her. She was taken to a mental home in late 1923. Her brother Dan brought her home a harmless lunatic in 1925 and kept her at home since. She died in 1949, and she wasn't the only one so impacted. Many others were, and you can see those in the military service pension applications for them by themselves, but also by family members where they were incapable of making the applications themselves. In August 1923, W.T. Cosgrave, president of the executive, visited a now quiet Tralee. However, Republican girls were determined to demonstrate their continued opposition. Here he encountered the type of women he had condemned in January 1923 as diehards. Women, he said, whose ecstasy at their extremists can find no outlet so satisfying as destruction. Éire, the Irish Nation, reported as he arrived in Tralee. At about a quarter of an hour before the meeting, a procession passed through the crowded streets. It was led by 2 girls carrying a huge black flag bearing the words in white lettering, "Our martyred Kerrymen." In the election in August 1923 also demonstrated the tension between the National Army and the Republican girls, especially during the election campaign. A report by anti-treaty activist Albina Broderick, or Gobnat Nivruther, who was herself wounded early in the year in an encounter with the Free State troops, noted, at a Cahirsiveen meeting, Captain Foley had to be removed from the meeting. He had previously kicked and ill-treated some of our girls and women, while in Sneem, the military pelted the Republican girls with eggs, struck them, and used foul and filthy language. However, these displays of militant female resistance were often dismissed as having little impact. An August report in 1923 from the Kerry Command noted, relations between the army and the people are mainly cordial. Open antagonism is displayed in some places, but it is generally the work of women. A loaded sentence, I would argue, there of dismissal and diminishment of the women. As Louise Ryan has shown in her article on Furies and Diehards, newspaper reports of militant anti-treaty women represented them as disorderly, disruptive, and their militancy as a way of questioning the manliness, courage, and strength of the anti-treaty men. The women were taking the fight, not the men. The men were only their camp followers. It's sort of a flip of the War of Independence days. This new state was now all about the work of nation building, the work of real pro-treaty men, and the bitterness of militant women. The die-hard gun girl belonged in a soon-to-be disremembered past. McGrath and Burkean, in discussing trauma stories as resilience in the Irish and Armenian context, note that mainstream commemorations play on strategies of resilience, endurance, continuity, adaptation, intransigence, inclusion, to construct and reinforce dominant narratives that tie together identity and nation. And so it was the sacrifice of the men during the trauma of the Civil War, brother against brother, how many times have we heard that? That is remembered and commemorated at Knocknagoshel, Clashmelkin, Countess Bridge and Ballyseedy, a memory of sacrifice and of some reconciliation in the pursuit of nation building, which was the work of men. But nowhere is female militancy, contribution, experience of violence and trauma of civil war commemorated. Even in Ballyseedy, women exist there as passive mourner, not active militant. In the answer to the question Clarke posed about using a gendered framework for understanding these violent and transformative years in Irish history, I would argue that in not recognising the gendered legacy impacts of female narratives of War of Independence and Civil War, we lose insights into the tensions and fears in the new state about militant, political and vocal women, and also some of the reasons why the post-war Irish state attempted to silence, contain and domesticate its female population. The threatening militant female diehard had to be obliterated from macro and micro narratives of revolution and war. Remembering her again transforms, I would argue, our historical memories and narratives, as well as our understandings of identity, inclusion and belonging. Thanks.
Mary, thank you very much indeed for many fascinating insights, including perhaps giving us a rationale for why there was such strong female opposition to the treaty, which is always a question I had in the back of my mind. But I think you've shed new light on that issue. Has anybody any comments or questions provoked by Mary's paper? Would like to share them with us? I suppose I just had one. Do we know, is there any comparative work that suggests that what happened in Ireland in terms of suppressing the memory of women's contribution, has that a parallel in any other system, say the Finnish War of Independence or anything similar? I'd be interested to hear.
Well, it's very interesting, actually. I am collaborating on a project at the moment on revolutionary trajectories, which looks at across European nations, 1918, 1919, 1920, where there were many revolutions, ones I hadn't even heard of myself before I started on that, like one in Switzerland and Finland, obviously in Eastern Europe, in Germany, in various other parts. And what we're looking at is women's participation in these revolutionary, and almost without fail, you find that narrative of suppression there, that women's roles in these is either absolutely elided or minimized. And the one I think about was the potato revolution in Finland. I think it was either Norway or Finland. Forgive me for forgetting which was actually started by women because there was a price hike on potatoes and it was their main food source for poorer women. But when the potato protest turned into something more political, the men took over, and the story of that revolution forgets that it started with women and food and potatoes. And so what we're doing is looking at how commemoration, and everyone's really impressed with the Irish commemorative decade, and how women have been really forcibly, I would argue, by many of us historians working on it, included in the commemoration. However, I have noticed, unless you keep saying, what about the women, there will be slippage. In many other parts, the woman who's working on the German revolutionary period says nothing about the women at all. And many other, they talk about how the women are forgotten. So it isn't a uniquely Irish thing at all. It is, it's the result of what I would say is working in a patriarchal society. Yeah, women's stories aren't important.
So, yes, please, if you take the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really enjoyable talk. Just a question, about the suppression of maybe women's voice. To what extent do you think, there was probably a difference between women as well as to what they believed the role of women was. To what extent did other women kind of control the expression of militancy by their sisters?
By their own sisters?
Well, by other women, not particularly
yes.
sisters. But
Well, when you look at, the intelligence war, and particularly the coercion of civilians, Cumann na mBan play a huge role in gathering information, both on what the Crown Forces were doing, but also on what other women were doing, and if they weren't living up to the Republican model of the proper Irish woman. So they're the ones who did a lot of reporting of the young women who were maybe seen stepping out with Crown Forces, and then facilitated, if not sometimes participated in the punishments. And there were differences between the Cumann na mBan women and arguments about, the role of women. And some of the Cumann na mBan women weren't particularly interested in being that militant, but quite a lot were. Interestingly, once the Free State is up and running, and once the position of women is being defined as respectable, pure domestic, marital, and then motherhood, the women who had split over the treaty often come together as political activists to resist that imposition of that domestic role for women. And you can see many of the women who had been on pro and anti-treaty sides, particularly in 1937, absolutely going up against the Constitution and the insertion of the women in the home articles, which of course are still in our Constitution. So the women had a lot, and I suppose it's an expression of their political development and their very sophisticated political development, that they had different ways of constructing militancy and womanhood and Irish femininity, and how they were to operate in society. But again, that gets lost in, I suppose, that broader narrative of Cumann na mBan as the girls who helped the women. I think it's very interesting to look at the political women themselves and how complicated they were and sophisticated they were in their own understanding of their position in society.
One more question, Colin? No? Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, please. June. Thank you.
Hello, Mary. That was very interesting. Just a question, maybe not have been some data that was gathered, but I'm just wondering, the women in the home, when the families would have known they put the home at risk, there must have been huge pressure to stop in some cases, or maybe go on in other cases. I'd just be really interested to know, was there any consistency around the home? Was there any patterns with the women in the home? Was the father there? Was the mother widowed? I just think it's very interesting.
Well, actually, the major pattern, and passion as well, because they were passionately involved, that comes out is that it's family. The majority of women who were involved also had brothers involved in maybe Sinn Féin, or they maybe not active in the IRA, but some of them would have been, or their extended family were involved. But there are some cases where some of the women say that nobody knew she was involved, and attacks came out of the blue. But Thomas mentioned that these attacks by the Crown Forces could happen for no particular reason. Yes, Cumann na mBan women were targeted, but sometimes the Crown Forces didn't know they were actually attacking a house that was a Republican house. They just were attacking a house for to create terror, and that's what they were doing. D.M. Leeson talks about that in his History of the Black and Tans, that the policy was to visit terror with terror, and that was part of it. But I haven't come across any Cumann woman as yet, and I can't say I've read all of the pension files because there's so many of them, that was asked to stop by anybody in her family. No. Okay, that's it. Oh, thank you.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. Our third speaker is Owen O'Shea, who is an Irish Research Council funded PhD student at UCD, who is researching politics in Kerry in the decade after the Civil War. He's published several books on Kerry history and politics, and his latest book is Ballymacandie, The Story of a Kerry Ambush. It was published by Merriam Press earlier this year. Owen is going to speak to us about reporting the revolution, newspapers in Kerry, 1920 to 1923. Owen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I'm just looking for the, oh, it's here. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to, like the other speakers, thank Morrison and the committee for inviting me. And I'm delighted to follow Thomas and Mary, who I've known and worked with on various projects for over many years, including our book on 1916 has been mentioned, and I'd like to just acknowledge the presence of Father Gahan, who contributed a chapter to that book on Austin Stack 5 years ago. My focus is on the reportage in the Kerry newspapers of the turbulent and seismic events of the War of Independence and the Civil War, focusing approximately on the period between 1920 and 23. And as a historian and researcher, I utilize the newspaper archives very regularly, and I cannot understate how valuable they are as a resource, particularly here in Kerry. And indeed, as a former journalist, I have a great interest in the history of the media, and in this case, how the press at the time approached their coverage of the dramatic political developments of a century ago. I should stress that my focus is more on how the press approached and presented the events of the period to their readers, rather than solely on what they reported. So my emphasis is on commentary, columnists, and editorials, more than what I might call the day-to-day news coverage. The press in Kerry at this time hasn't been the subject of any in-depth published analysis, despite the breadth and depth of the coverage and the sheer number of newspapers sometimes in circulation in the county. Newspapers were the principal means by which the people of Kerry and the country learned about the political and military incidents at the time, and as such, their impact and influence on the political discourse cannot be understated. Moreover, as a first-hand account of the events of this seminal period in the history of our county, the value of the newspaper columns from this time is, I would argue, enormously significant. So I hope to illustrate, albeit briefly, the challenges and the dilemmas facing reporters and editors in the county at the time as the War of Independence and the Civil War raged, and show how what was published and how events were portrayed often had extremely grave consequences for the press, particularly in the years between 1920 and 23. Just by way of a short introduction, I'd like to briefly describe the newspaper landscape in Kerry around 1919-1920. It was a busy and quite competitive field, as you can see here. At the beginning of 1920, as the War of Independence was beginning to intensify in Kerry, there were a total of 6 newspapers in circulation in the county, which was unusually high if we compare this to other counties. But I think it's further evidence, if it were needed, I suppose, of the insatiable appetite of the people of Kerry for news. I will introduce each of them very briefly, as I think the details of press circulation and ownership at the time is important from a political point of view. The Kerry People, firstly, is important for a number of reasons I'll come to later. First published in 1902, it pledged to be Catholic and nationalist in its outlook. And as we can see here from its front page on the right, it was primarily a weekly advertiser with adverts on its front and back page.
the news coverage was inside, even at that it was quite limited. The Kerry People was edited by an important figure in Kerry and indeed Irish journalism, Maurice Ryle from Tralee, and Ryle was later editor of the Evening Herald and deputy editor of the Irish Independent. Importantly, from a continuity point of view, the Kerry People, albeit only a 4 and later a 6-page publication with less news coverage than many of the other publications, was the only newspaper in Kerry to be published without interruption throughout the War of Independence. The Kerry Weekly Reporter was one of several newspapers owned by the Quinnell family, John Quinnell and Sons, who were significant business people in Tralee, and they were described in one report from the time as unionists, which is perhaps a bit simplistic. It was published from 1883, but only until 1920, and later the Weekly Reporter was merged with the Killarney Echo to become the Kerry Reporter in the later 1920s. The Kerry News here at the bottom was published twice weekly, and it provided a significant amount of national and international news. It was also founded, owned and published by John Quinnell and Sons. The Kerry News lasted until 1941, but again, there were interruptions during the period we're talking about. The Killarney Echo and South Kerry Chronicle, sometimes under the Irish title Machala Killarney at the bottom there, was originally owned by the Irish Parliamentary Party MP from Killarney, John Murphy, pictured there, and was therefore obviously quite nationalist in its outlook. Also published only until 1920, unfortunately. It later merged with the Kerry Weekly Reporter. The Kerryman, established in 1904, was the most enduring news sheet of the 20th century and, of course, continues to be published to this day. It probably needs the least introduction, but it also published quite significantly between 1914 and 1939, The Liberator, which was published 3 times a week and circulated principally in Tralee. It was a much slimmer broadsheet, running to just 4 pages, but its political stance and outlook, which was Republican and nationalist, was identical to that of its publisher, the Kerryman. The Kerryman and the Liberator were owned by the cousins Thomas and Dan Nolan, along with Maurice Griffin, its managing editor. And Griffin, who's in the front and centre of that photograph, he probably most influenced their political ethos because he was active in Sinn Féin and was a member of Tralee Urban District Council. And in fact, he was jailed for a period after the Easter Rising. So in the years before independence, the Kerryman had, in the words of another Kerry historian, Gordon Revington, firmly directed public opinion towards the aims of the Irish Republican and the Fenian Brotherhoods. So it was no surprise then, I suppose, that it was supportive of the Sinn Féin cause in the years before and during the War of Independence. And for that, the Kerryman and the Liberator would suffer very significant consequences. So those are the 6 newspapers which are of relevance to the period. In the lead up to and during the War of Independence, the Kerry press reported the incidents and events of the conflict itself, like all of their regional and national counterparts across the country. Many carried the reports provided by their own reporters, as well as by national and international news agencies. Editorially, however, which is the focus of my presentation today, as the War of Independence progressed, the campaign for independence was amplified by the newspapers. The presence of British troops in Ireland was increasingly condemned, and the anti-British rhetoric was dialed up and up. So there was, for example, plenty of invective directed at political figures like Hammer Greenwood and Edward Carson, and of course the British Prime Minister himself. Lloyd George was referred to by the Kerry people as, quote, an insufferable little cad, which is pretty polite, I suppose, compared to what today's British Prime Minister might be called in the press. The Northern Ireland Parliament was condemned as, quote, a mock parliament supported by zealots and bigots. Partition was, the Kerryman stated, an egregious mistake. Pacification, it declared, and I quote, cannot be brought about in Ireland by trying to thrust down the throats of the people an act calculated and meant to create further dissension and dismemberment among our people. From every point of view, the editorial continued, commercially, economically, and politically, Ireland must remain one and indivisible nation, end quote. And I've drawn out just a handful of examples of the type of language which was used in the Kerryman editorials during 1920 and 21, just as a flavour, if you like, or a few examples of the type of rhetoric that became increasingly, was ratcheted up, I suppose, during this period, and which I'm sure didn't go unnoticed in Ballymullen Barracks or in Dublin Castle. So these are from various stages during 20 and 21. Ireland is going to keep her course without a swerve. If they, the British, don't want to be bothered, let them clear out of the country. The Lords and Commons of Britain can never bind Ireland. Irish people had the right to rule themselves according to their own ideas. Joe Devlin and some of the remaining Irish parliamentary MPs in the north were condemned as shallow-pated, fossilised specimens of Irishmen. And another comment read, Sinn Féin knows better than to have any scheming of Lloyd George's. But what we do sometimes get, despite all the hyperbole, is appeals for peace. And as you see here at the bottom, let us hope for, declared the Kerryman in the spring of 1921, a sure and lasting peace. That was, however, the exception rather than the rule. It wasn't just the editors like Maurice Ryle or Maurice Griffins of the Kerry newspapers who were having their say, however. Perhaps more interesting and insightful in this period, and Thomas referred to them earlier, are the local news columns in the press at the time, which offered plenty of strong opinions on the revolution as it developed. And I speak of columns such as Pars from Puck, I'll let you guess where that was from, Castle Island Comments, Dingle Doings, and Fiery's Notes, to name but a few. And this is actually from the front page of the Kerryman, the first edition of 1920, and they were given, front page prominence in the newspapers. Written anonymously by local columnists, but rich with invective and opinion on matters of state as well as in the localities, the local notes and columns offer us a further detail, I suppose, in relation to public opinion at this time. So, for example, in relation to conscription before the War of Independence, the Kilorland Correspondent was moved to condemn conscription as provoking consternation and indignation in the locality. In 1920, the Dingle column reported on the fact that 200 people had emigrated from West Kerry. It is pitiable, said the columnist, to see the lifeblood of the country drained like this after so many sacrifices by Irishmen. And columnists were not shy in expressing their own political opinions. In June 1920, for example, the Kilordan correspondent noted that the volunteers had, quote, gained the confidence and respect of the people of the town and district. I could probably devote an entire talk to these local news columns, but I do think they deserve a mention here because they were used to great effect to expound on the political developments of the day. So given that inflammatory language that often emanated from the pages of the Kerry Press in 1919-20, it was little wonder perhaps that the publications printing this sort of material and opinion became a focus of the anger of the Crown forces. So in September 1919, 3 of the local newspapers were suppressed by the authorities for publishing the Dáil Prospectus, which was the loan scheme devised by the Dáil to raise funds. And pictured, that's a copy of the advertisement there on the right, which was printed by the 3 newspapers, the Reporter, the News, and the Killarney Echo. This was seen as a step too far by the authorities, and it was decried as Republican propaganda. The Evening Herald from September 1919 reported on what happened to the 3 Kerry newspapers as a result. Shortly after 11 o'clock this morning, a party of police accompanied by a number of military entered the offices of J. Quinnell and Sons and suppressed the Kerry News, the Kerry Weekly Reporter, and the Killarney Echo. Portions of the rotary machine on which the papers were printed have been taken away. The raid was ordered under DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, end quote. Both the Kerrymen and the Kerry people escaped the same fate, having, for whatever reasons, and luckily for them, decided not to publish the Dáil Prospectus. The following year, however, and in further evidence of the difficulties facing the local press at the time, the Kerryman was forced to shut down temporarily because of the turmoil and chaos during the so-called Siege of Tralee, which effectively shut down the town for a period of 9 or 10 days. With Tralee on an effective lockdown, the Kerryman wasn't published for 2 weeks, and when it resumed publication on the 27th of November 1920, it has been noted by the press historian Mark O'Brien that no mention of the details of the orgy of violence that had typified the early days of November 1920 was made. It did, however, apologise to readers and advertisers for the, quote, enforced cessation of publication. Interestingly, the editorial concluded on a somewhat moderate note, saying that in the future, as in the past, the paper would do our utmost to discharge our duty faithfully and impartially. This approach, I think, is indicative of a political nous on the part of management at the Kerryman. They had seen with the other newspapers I mentioned how the Crown forces had suppressed other local publications the previous year. But there were also perhaps commercial pressures too, because the Kerryman was, after all, an employer and a company reliant on advertising and sales. It wanted to get back to business, even if there were evident tensions between editorial approaches and commercial demands. All of that changed dramatically a few months later, however, following a high-profile assassination on a golf course near Tralee. On the 18th of April 1921, the much-loathed Major McKinnon of the Auxiliaries was shot dead in one of the most high-profile killings of the War of Independence in Kerry. Later that day, the Kerryman offices were paid a visit by the authorities, who insisted that as a mark of respect on the passing of McKinnon, that the Liberator newspaper, which was owned by the Kerryman, be printed in thick black lined columns to honour the deceased McKinnon. The Liberator refused to do so, and the printing presses stopped printing the paper for a few weeks. A few days later, however, the Auxiliaries blew the Kerryman offices to smithereens, and the printing presses went up in flames during a burning and bombing spree by the Crown forces in Tralee. The incident was reported in the Irish Independent of the 21st of April, which said books, papers and desks were thrown around, 3 explosions were heard within, and extensive injury was caused to the machinery. It's expected that it will be months before publication can be resumed, end quote. In fact, it would be over 2 years before either the Liberator or the Kerryman hit the streets again. Between April 1921 and August 1923, they were not published, leaving a very significant void, not only in readers' lives at the time, but also, to be selfish about it, in facilitating historians' desire to read first-hand accounts of the history of the period. The truce, which brought an end to the War of Independence when it came in July 1921, was warmly welcomed by the only newspaper then left standing, the Kerry People. If there was any prevailing emotion abroad at the end of the year, it was relief, and we do get a sense of that from the pages of the Kerry People at the time. The truce of God was how the cessation of violence was welcomed. God grant that it may be the harbinger of an enduring peace in our long distracted country, said the editorial. Each man should now regard himself as the custodian of the nation's honour. But what we also get a sense of is how life in Kerry returned to, or was trying to return to, normal after the War of Independence. And one editorial noted that the coming of the truce had, quote, made a complete change in the whole face of things. Business and pleasure have once more become the features of the life of the people of Tralee. The spirit of peace is abroad. It is to be seen in every face and in every form of nature. So we can see not only an actual resumption of many of the normal social and commercial activities during the truce period, excuse me, we can also hear a kind of a genuine desire, I suppose, for a maintenance of peace and perhaps the fatigue that did exist following the violence of the previous 2 years. Of course, as we know, the peace was to be short-lived, and the signing of the treaty at the end of 1921 heralded a new period of turmoil. Sadly, we are deprived of any extant copies of the Kerry People, or indeed any other newspaper in Kerry, in the final months of 1921, when the negotiations were underway in London. The approach of the local press to the treaty would only become most apparent and most obvious after the Civil War, and particularly during the 1923 general election. We do have copies of the Kerry People to hand from the beginning of 1922, however, as TDs debated and voted on the treaty. And in this report, just as an example, we can see how the Kerry TDs Fionn Lynch from this part of the county and Paddy Cahill from Tralee were heckled by demonstrators at Tralee train station as they departed for Dublin to vote on the treaty. The anti-treaty demonstrators included members of Fianna Éireann and Cumann Amon, who bore placards with words including "No partition, but unity in Ireland." During the period of the Civil War, the Kerry People provided, and again, this is the only newspaper in circulation at this time, it provided what has been described by historian Tom Doyle as accurate and balanced coverage of the conflict. And as we shall see, its independent editorial line did not endear it to Republicans. Events were presented in the Kerry People, as I said, the only newspaper in circulation as the Civil War loomed and began, with neither a pro or anti-treaty stance particularly evident. So, for example, we've coverage of the rallies held by Collins and De Valera in Kerry before the June 1922 election, and during which De Valera in Killarney infamously proclaimed that the volunteers would have to wade through Irish blood to achieve freedom. But what we also get from the Kerry People during the Civil War is something which Thomas has dealt with in his presentation and his book, is the civilian experience, or the experience of the ordinary citizen of Kerry in the context of the upheaval and disruption of the Civil War. And this, I think, is as fascinating and informative as the coverage of the military incidents and the conflict itself, because it gives us a real sense that as the Civil War swirled around them, ordinary people in Kerry were increasingly frustrated and incensed by the social and economic disruption it was causing. So, for example, on the very same day that the TDs voted on the treaty in Dublin, the Kerry People editorial demanded action on the dirt and darkness in Tralee, where the gas supply is execrable and the rates were too high. Transport and communication disruption remained a common occurrence, and strikes often brought train services in the county to a halt, with a knock-on impact on trade as well as postal services. And there are other similar reports of the economic hardship and distress which prevailed, and I think which give us an insight into, if you like, the popular experience of the conflict, the Civil War, as it continued. During the Civil War, as I've said, we're restricted to the Kerry People for the first-hand accounts of the conflict, but sadly all of that changed utterly in the autumn of 1922. That's because of the suppression of the Kerry People by the anti-treatyites in August of that year. And like any newspaper at the time, and still today, the Kerry People needed advertising revenue. And maintaining an income from advertising sometimes required publishing advertisements for the Free State Army, including this controversial notice, which the People published on the 26th of August, 1922, headed "To the Men of the Army." It was a morale-boosting message to the troops in Kerry from General Richard Mulcahy. And within days of posting the missive, however, the printing press of the Kerry People at Barrack Place in Tralee was dismantled by anti-treatyites, and, quote, "the vital parts of the machine were taken away, rendering publication of the newspaper impossible." So in the same way as some of the newspapers during the War of Independence had incurred the wrath of the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans, now in this instance a newspaper was experiencing the wrath of those who were opposing the treaty in Kerry. The temporary demise of the Kerry People deprived readers in Kerry of the only extant newspaper then printed in the county, and the newspaper was not in a position to resume publication until June 1923. But like many property owners and businesses at the time, the management of the Kerry People sought compensation from the government for the loss of income and property. And a few months after the newspaper was shut down, the editor, Maurice Ryle, explained the loss that he and his employees had suffered in a letter he sent to Pieris Beasley, a pro-treaty TD for Kerry, who's pictured here. And Maurice Ryle, the editor of the People, wrote, and I quote, "Outside our ordinary trading losses, we have missed out on about £1,000 worth of printing and advertising work, which would have come to us from the army and government had our office been allowed to function. We went down in the service of the Free State and have been brought to the brink of financial disaster." As a result of the closure of the Kerry People at the end of August 1922, Kerry newspapers were left with just one remaining option to read, albeit a very limited one, and with a very clear political agenda. And that was the anti-treaty newspaper, the Kerry Leader, which rarely gets a mention, perhaps understandably because it didn't last very long. The Kerry Leader was published in Tralee for several months during 1922, and
It was one of the very few explicitly anti-treaty newspapers published anywhere in Ireland at the time. It was co-founded and edited by Tralee man Sean Moynihan, pictured here on the left, who was later a personal secretary to Eamon de Valera. The leader certainly wasn't shy in adopting a very hostile approach to the Free State regime and its army, because to coincide with the visit by Michael Collins to Tralee in April 1922, which I mentioned, the Kerry leader published a series of open questions to Collins about his position on the treaty, which he actually addressed during his address to people in Tralee on that occasion. But Collins and his allies got their own back, because the Kerry leader was suppressed by the Free State forces following their arrival in large numbers in Kerry in August 1922, and after its refusal to publish a Free State proclamation. And Sean Moynihan, the editor, as well as the newspaper's manager, Eamon O'Connor, were jailed amid accusations by Republicans of, quote, silencing possible criticism of the policy and actions of the Free State authorities and their agents. And sadly, as far as I'm aware anyway, there are no remaining or existing copies of the Kerry leader, which, despite its brevity, I suppose, was, did make an impact at the time. So finally, and briefly, after the Civil War, to touch on it briefly, because I think it sort of closes the circle, so to speak, the Kerryman didn't resume publication until August 1923, just weeks before the general election of the 27th of August. And from the moment it resumed publication, the Kerryman, and indeed the Liberator, adopted a very clear and very vocal pro-treaty and pro-Cumann position. The Kerryman management certainly took the view, in the words of Dan Nolan, that, quote, the only hope was to work the treaty. The Civil War was condemned by the Liberator as a matter of, quote, incomprehensible folly, amounting almost to morbid perversity. And that language, I think, is quite striking, because now unfettered by the pressures of the conflict itself, the Kerryman and the Liberator were able to engage in a full-blown condemnation of what they called the irregular delirium of the 1922-23 period, and efforts, as they saw it, to bring chaos and destruction to the country. The editorials and the coverage would continue to be very strongly pro-treaty and pro-Cumann Oil as the early 1920s progressed, not just in the Kerryman and the Liberator, but also in the other publications, which gradually in the early 1920s came back into print in Kerry, including the Kerry News, the Kerry People, and the Kerry Reporter. Just very briefly, all of that only really changed, I suppose, with the emergence in 1928 of the Kerry Champion, which was very strongly supportive of Fianna Fáil and represented kind of the first significant change after the Civil War in the newspaper landscape in political terms in Kerry. And its impact was very immediate and very substantial. It was co-founded by Paddy Cahill, who was an anti-treaty Kerry TD and had been a prominent figure in the War of Independence in Kerry. And so supportive was the paper of Fianna Fáil in the late 1920s and early 1930s that it celebrated the results of the 1933 election, in which Fianna Fáil won 5 of the 7 seats in Kerry, by declaring that the results showed that Kerry was now, quote, more Republican than ever. That's to, I suppose, get somewhat ahead of the period, but I think it's important to mention that a decade after the Civil War, the political balance of voices and editorials in the county had shifted very considerably. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a really quick whistle-stop tour through the story of the Kerry newspapers and the revolution of a century ago. I hope you found it informative. Just to shamelessly say that I do have copies of my recently published book on the Ballymacandie ambush with me if anyone is looking for a Christmas present or even a Halloween present. So thank you all very much for listening. Gur míle maith agaibh.
Owen, thank you very much for really bringing home to us the perils of publishing a newspaper during a time of a war of independence and the Civil War. It's an absolute nightmare. Anyway, fascinating to see that some of those newspapers have survived and are still with us today and informing the people of Kerry and providing good source of good sources for future generations of historians. So now, has anybody any questions or comments about the newspaper coverage of the War of Independence and the Civil War in Kerry? Again, I suppose the question I'd ask is do we know how different Kerry was, say, from Cork or from other counties that would have had a vibrant local press?
Yeah, the number of, in fact, the Atlas on the Irish Revolution has quite a lot of detail on this. The Kerry Leader that I mentioned was one, I think, of only 3 or 4 specifically, anti-treaty publications during the Civil War. In terms of the number of newspapers that were in circulation and publication, Kerry's was quite high, if not one of the highest, with 6 newspapers in publication at the beginning of this period. That's indicative of, as I said a while ago, the huge appetite for news. But it also, I think, if you take the Liberator, which was published 3 times a week, gave so much detail from the period that they're such an immensely useful resource for us now looking back in the period, despite the fact that in 1919, 1920, so many of them were suppressed, and again during the Civil War that the Kerry people was suppressed. But as you say, I think it's I think the availability now through the Irish News newspaper archives, which are online, enables us to dig a little bit deeper into the type of detail that Thomas and Mary and I were talking about earlier, the reports that are there from the period and that are now so available to us. But as you said also, it highlights the real dangers and hazards of being a newspaper editor or publishing a newspaper in not only during the War of Independence but also during the Civil War. And unfortunately, some of them didn't survive too long after that. But as you said, the Kerryman is still with us and has stood the test of time. Yeah.
No, please, yeah, you have your hand up. Would you mind using the microphone, because no, I can't. I'm afraid because people online can't hear you if you don't use the mic. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I was only going to ask if individual journalists were ever targets for reprisals either by pro or anti-treaty crowds.
That's a good question. None that I'm aware of. I stand to be corrected, but I suppose the targeting was there was obviously a recognition on the part of the Crown Forces, and in the case of the Kerry people, the anti-treatyites, of the enormous financial impact that the destruction of the printing presses could have. So, when the newspapers had to shut down, there were so many people who were out of work, including the reporters, the people who printed the newspaper, who distributed the newspaper. So I'm not aware of any particular journalists who were targeted in that way. It's quite possible that they were, given what they were writing. But bear in mind, there weren't any bylines in the press at the time, and that it wasn't an article written by Eoin O'Shea or by whoever it was. So it might have been that little bit more difficult to identify individual reporters, but the editors would have been known and would have been well-known figures. But I think the modus operandi of those who opposed what they were writing about and how they were portraying events was to, if you like, instead of shooting the messenger, to take out the means by which they were publishing this material. And as we can see, that proved very effective and destructive for so many of them at this turbulent time.
Any other comments, questions, reflections? But I suppose it just reminds us how important, well, we may take our press for granted, but certainly the history of the Kerry press shows that in times of turmoil, the press is very vulnerable, that's for sure. So I think it just remains to me to thank Eoin for an excellent presentation, and also to thank Mary and Thomas Earls for their stimulating presentations too. I think it's been really excellent session. And I'd like to, perhaps you give our three speakers a round of applause. Now, if I could just address a few issues of housekeeping before we take a little break and then resume promptly at 4 o'clock for the next session, which will be the launch by Sir Adrian Fitzgerald of his book, and Professor Canning will be moderating that particular session. But just to maybe mention a few things about the school tomorrow in Derrynane. We will begin proceedings at 10 o'clock in Derrynane tomorrow. The weather is not going to be in our favour. We may be called a summer school, but when we hold it in the autumn, we risk the elements. And as you know, in Derrynane, it's a little complicated. So do come prepared with warm clothing and bring your umbrellas, because there's a little walk in from the car park into the house. For those of you that registered today, we would ask you to register again tomorrow, because you probably received a blue wristband today, but you're going to be given a green wristband for tomorrow's proceedings. You won't have to display your covert certificates again, but we would ask you to register. And if you'd also just let the team at reception know if you have any dietary restrictions. Lunch will be available, but the team there need to know if you have any particular requirements. So please let us know. Tomorrow's talk, we cannot live stream it, but as Maurice mentioned earlier, but it will be recorded and it will be available on our website from Wednesday onwards, as will today's proceedings. So I think, I'm looking down at Maurice here now, I think we can take a little break, stretch our legs, and I'd ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to be back here for at 5 to 4 when we will have the book launch. Thank you very much indeed. Oh, I should have said that some of you may also be going to the tribute to Junior Murphy in St. Mary's GAA grounds at 5 o'clock. So it's a 10-15 minute walk. So those of you that are planning to go, will you take that into account? And they would, because of the waning light and it's being held outdoors, they need to start promptly at 5 o'clock. So if you wish to be there, please make your way there. Be out of here by about 4:45. Thank you very much indeed.
When I was speaking this morning, I mentioned that this was an important interlude in publications in Kerry history. And I think from the last session, we heard mention of several books. And now we're going to have yet another book, A Man of His Times, The Papers of Robert Fitzgerald, the 17th Knight of Kerry, which has been edited by his direct descendant, Sir Adrian Fitzgerald, who is the 24th Knight of Kerry. So a book about the 17th Knight has been edited by the 24th Knight, and the papers of the family have all been deposited in the Boo Library of University College Cork, and this is a calendar of the paper of the 17th Knight. And I will give some reactions to the book before introducing you to Sir Adrian himself. But I've read it with great interest. It is, as I said, a calendar of an 18th century figure. His dates were 1716 to 1781. But looking at the copy of the portrait and comparing it with the man we have before us today and his picture at the back, it's quite remarkable that the Fitzgerald genes have been so strong, and there is this strong family resemblance from the 18th century right down to the 21st. Looking at the title of the book, Robert Fitzgerald, the 17th Knight of Kerry, one might expect a book that might be heavily involved with family estate records, which you normally would expect from a book with a title of that kind. There are some references to estates, but it's mostly the extent to which his immediate predecessor, his nephew squandered the estate rather than estate management papers themselves, because the 17th Knight of Kerry was only Knight of Kerry for 2 years, the last 2 years of his life. In other words, they're the papers of a younger son. His older brother John had succeeded to the title on the death of his father, and when John died in 1741, the title fell to John's son, who was nephew of Robert. And it was only after the nephew died without male heirs that Robert inherited the title, and I said just for the last 2 years of his life. So most of the book is really about how a younger son of a family survived and made his way in the world without having inherited a family estate. Insofar as he had land, it was for most of his life, it was land that he leased rather than land which he had inherited directly. And it was only as it became evident he was going to inherit the property that he became concerned with the future of this property, which, as I said, was being squandered away. Even the family house, Grove House, was lost to the Townsend because his nephew had married the Townsend of Castle Townsend. Now, the family itself were one of those families who were on the losing side, or at best on the neutral side, during the 17th century. So they had been relatively neutral during the Confederate Wars, and in that sense suffered a loss of property with the Cromwellian conquest of the country. And again, they were supporters of James II in the Jacobite-Williamite conflict. And insofar as they recovered their position, they, like some other families, recovered their position when Queen Anne came to the throne. And some of the families who had supported James II had a possibility of recovering some of what had been lost when Queen Anne came to the throne, because Queen Anne was supported by Tories as opposed to the Whigs who had been in power when William and Mary had been in office. So that Queen Anne was sympathetic to some of those who had supported her father, provided they were willing to conform in religion. The actual act of conformity itself doesn't feature in this book, but it's quite clear that Robert had been brought up a Protestant, and we're introduced to him at the point when he's involved in the Grand Tour. And the Grand Tour brings him to Italy, brings him to Constantinople, to Berlin, and to Warsaw. And quite clearly, the benefit of a Grand Tour was that it provided one with good contacts. And we can see how he uses his contacts with the relatives of the nobility in England, as well as with the Provost of Trinity College Dublin, in order to secure something for himself, the something being government office. So that in that sense, his source of income at the high point of his career comes altogether more from the pensions associated with office held under government rather than from the ownership or the management of land itself. But then particularly his association with Francis Andrews, Provost of Trinity College Dublin, it's mostly a correspondence about matters literary and artistic, but he's also concerned with finding placements for some of his nephews who were in religious orders. And interesting correspondence because this one nephew in particular wants to have a plurality of benefits, which cause embarrassment to would-be patrons, in that they're trying to persuade him to surrender one church living before they canvass his case for another. So there are interesting matters of this kind, and the questions that I find of particular interest is the way in which he was concerned to maintain correspondence with all of his kin, regardless of whether they were in Kerry or in other parts of Ireland, whether they were in religious orders, or whether they were in good standing or frittering the family resources away. That he maintains correspondence with all, tries to maintain good relations with all, but he also maintains contact with the family members who have remained Catholic and who are in exile in the continent of Europe. Sir Adrian seems to suggest that this was done surreptitiously, but I find looking at similar associations with the Clanrickard family, the Clanrickard Burkes of County Galway. They were a family who also had backed the wrong side in the Jacobite-Williamite wars, and again recover their positions once they conform in religion during the reign of Queen Anne. But in the case of both the 10th and the 11th Earls of Clanrickard, they maintain steady contact with their continental exiles, and in fact they're using the honours and distinctions which are being given to their relatives who are in service in France and Spain to argue the case that this demonstrates the capability of the family, the honour which is bestowed on them, and that is all the more reason why they should be recognised by the Hanoverian monarchy. So that in that sense, recognising relatives who have done well, even if they are associated with your political opponents, is something that should be to your credit rather than to your disadvantage. Another factor that I found particularly interesting is how these Protestant gentlemen maintain contact with priests in their continental journeys. And that's a point that has come out in some recent papers that have been published on Irish gentlemen in the Grand Tour in the 18th century. And that Irish gentlemen, young sons of nobility or squires, on the Grand Tour tended to have something of an advantage over their English counterparts, in that when they turned up in Italy, they could make contact with Irish priests from the same localities of themselves frequently, who acted as their guides, and as we can see here, continue to be their correspondents and provided them with books after they had returned to Ireland. So you find Andrews having contacts with Catholic priests in the continent to find books that he's interested in. The funny thing is that this does not necessarily, this means that Irish Protestants who abided by the law when they were in Ireland were altogether more broad-minded in their dealings with Catholics, and including Catholic clergy when they were in continental situations. That doesn't mean that when these priests returned to Ireland that they could expect a particular favour under the law after they returned. These were kind of gentlemanly arrangements, and both sides understood the rules of the game, and that you had to conform to the rules, the law of the land when you were within Ireland, and you could be in an altogether more relaxed situation when you encountered such people in the continent and continued to correspond with them. I'm just mentioning a few of the things that I found interesting in this particular collection. I think we're especially grateful to Sir Adrian for having put this collection together, and even equally so for having made the entire collection of family papers from the 18th century, more or less down to the present, available to the interested researcher in the Boo Library. And Sir Adrian will now tell us more about the book and the collection itself. So congratulations.
Well, first of all, I'd really like to thank Professor Nicholas Canny most profusely for introducing the book so thoroughly, leaving me almost to say nothing at all, because it really seems to sum up this rather curious character, my ancestor, so very worthily. I'd also, if I may, like to thank Professor Maurice Brick for making this launch possible during the conference. And it's always lovely to be back with the Daniel O'Connell Memorial Conference or school, and I'm really loving it this time too. And I'd also like to, if I may, refer to my very old friend Canon Tony Gohan, without whom this book would never have been written. He's not only a very good friend, but he's a very good bully, and he's bullied me into completing the book at a time when I might well not have done so. So I thank him enormously for his support and his enabling the publication to take place. I want to just add one or two things to what Professor Canny has said. only one or two, because I really don't think there's an awful lot to be added. But the political career of Robert Fitzgerald was really not particularly successful. He was ambitious, but not successful in obtaining political office. He did, however, obtain office, as Professor Caddy mentioned, in various government preferments, Judge of the Admiralty Court, Revenue Commissioner, and so on. And some of his preferments, I think, were probably sinecures, but others involved a little bit more work. He does, however, I think, create in his lifetime, a rather curious bridge between the 17th century and the last 2 decades of the 18th century. And I'd just like to develop for a short minute or two his connection with the 17th century and the baggage that he brought from the Treaty of Limerick, when his own family managed to escape the results of the Treaty of Limerick, which could well have been leaving Ireland forever, with more or less what the people who had to do that, the wild geese, were standing up in. His father was very young at the time of the wild geese, and was supposed to have been brought to court having played some quite energetic ball game, which meant that he was pink in the face and perhaps a bit younger looking than he really was. And his defense counsel this is family tradition. His defense counsel is supposed to have presented him to the judge and said, you couldn't possibly convict a young man like this because he's really no more than a child. And that is meant to be how they got away with keeping their estates, or some of them, and remaining in Ireland. The aftermath of the Treaty of Limerick, which led to so many families leaving Ireland, meant that a large number of cousins, close friends of the family, went away forever. And I wanted to just refer to really one of them in particular, and that is Charles O'Brien, who became the first Irish Marshal of the French Army. Now, O'Brien first came to really serious notice when his regiment came in at a moment in the Battle of Fontenoy, when the French and the British were at war. They came in on the French side at the Battle of Fontenoy and really turned the battle and won it for the French. So he became a terrific hero amongst, obviously, all the members of the Irish Brigade, but also amongst the French nation as a whole. And the interesting thing I think about O'Brien is that he then went on 8 or so years after the Battle of Fontenoy to be in close touch with Robert, my ancestor, about recruiting closer members of our family to join him as recruits in the Irish Brigade. And that, I'm fairly sure, was actually illegal at the time. So, you know, there was a certain moving close to the edge of the law. What happened after that is in some ways even more remarkable, because I think young Maurice Fitzgerald was recruited in around 1753, but by 1759, Charles O'Brien, by then a marshal, he'd been attainted as Viscount Clare and the Earl of Thomond, but the French had actually restored his titles, as it were, in French, despite the fact they'd been removed in the Irish scene. But O'Brien, the Marshal, was chosen by the French government to lead a force of 18,000 French and Irish troops to invade Ireland and presumably to restore the Stuart monarchy. There had, of course, already been 2 Stuart rebellions on the island of Great Britain, which had failed. And it seems that there was going to be a last attempt, it must have been, to restore the Stuarts through Ireland. That invasion was aborted at the last minute, and O'Brien died quite suddenly a couple of years later. That's just an example of the fairly close sailing against the wind that went on, I think, in those days. To give you some idea, though, of what Morris did achieve during his lifetime, he despite having no likely chances of inheriting any land because of his nature as a younger son, he bought head leases just a few miles from here on Valentia Island. He bought about 2/3 of the island for an absentee family called Annesley. And though he remained fairly absentee in Valentia for his lifetime, his son and grandson having later become resident, he did actually energize life in Valentia by introducing the growing of flax and the weaving of linen. And that really predated more industry introduced by his son and grandson in Valentia, like the opening of the slate mine and the laying of the Atlantic telegraph cable. So in a way, he was a forerunner, I think, of further things that happened in Valentia over the coming 100 years or so. He was always quite ambitious, and I think his ambitions come out in the letters. At one time, he got rather fed up with not getting political preferment in Ireland, and he decided he'd try and become an MP in England. And that led nowhere. And right up to the end of his life, I think in the year before he died, he was still making a bid to become Chief Secretary of Ireland, which would have been, in those days, a pivotal position in political life between Ireland and England. The professor has already talked about the Grand Tour, and that is quite an interesting part of his life and is dealt with in a number of letters in the book. I only want to say one more thing. It's a sort of warning that the humor at that period is fairly bawdy. In some cases, it's downright crude, as I say in the introduction. And I can assure you that if rude words are mentioned, we've put the necessary dashes in so that people don't need to be too offended, I hope. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if anybody wants me to sign a book, I'll be very happy to do so. Thank you. And thank you very much.
Again, congratulations, Mr. Adrian, and there are copies of the book available for purchase at price
25 euros.
25 euros. Very good.